So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and there's a really troubling concatenation of events, that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com. Today we're reading The Shadow President, The Truth About Mike Pence by Michael D'Antonio. This is from the first chapter. For decades, Pence had presented himself as a humble servant who could be entrusted with power because he was at heart a mild-mannered Midwesterner. Friends and foes alike said his major character trait was extreme niceness. When given the opportunity, Pence described himself as a true Hoosier, son of Indiana, who was a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. This is how he had introduced himself to the country at the Republican National Convention 6 months earlier. The list contrasted with the usual pledge politicians make to put country first. This is what President Obama did after the 2016 election, when he said, "We are not Democrats first, we are not Republicans first, we are Americans first." The vice president's self-declared identity revealed both his priorities and the source of his power. For 30 years, he had helped lead the Republican Party into a closer alliance with preachers who were turning evangelical Christianity from a religion into a political crusade that engaged in a culture war with non-believers. The aim of many was to destroy abortion rights, roll back the equality gained by gay citizens, and prepare the nation for the second coming of Christ. Pence and others used martial metaphors and considered themselves warriors of the Christian right, both besieged and called upon to fight. Quote, "Those who would have us ignore the battle being fought over life, marriage, and religious liberty have forgotten the lessons of history," said Pence in 2010. "America's darkest moments have come when economic arguments trumped moral principles." Pence's allies in his war included hugely wealthy donors who, despite their vast wealth accumulated at a time of historic inequality, also posed as victims. As libertarians in the mold of Ayn Rand's cardboard characters, they felt inhibited in the pursuit of even greater riches by a government that imposed foolish regulations and would redistribute their wealth to the supposedly indolent poor. Starting with this perspective, they denied the science behind environmental protection, demanded tax cuts for themselves, and insisted on massive reductions in programs serving anyone who wasn't rich. The victimhood claimed by both the libertarians and the Christian right permitted the construction of an alternative reality that denied their own power and masked their ambition to make politics and culture conform to an ideology that included white Christian supremacy and predatory capitalism. It also denied the progress they had made in their construction of their own political might. With his oath of office, Vice President Pence became both the free marketer's hero and the most successful Christian supremacist in American history. Most of Pence's life had been preparation for this moment, and possibly one more. His lifelong goal, set when he was a boy, was the Oval Office itself. Remarkably, he had reached this point by tying his fate to Donald J. Trump, a man whose immorality in the form of lying, cheating, and deceiving in every aspect of his life, from his marriage to his businesses, had made him a living exemplar of everything that Christianity and conservatism abhorred. However, this record also suggested that Pence was more likely to assume the highest office in the land than most vice presidents who had come before. To put it bluntly, Trump was vulnerable to impeachment. If this occurred, Pence would see the hand of God at work in his elevation to the presidency. In the meantime, he would wait and watch. On Inauguration Day, with Pence looking on, a slightly stooped Donald Trump stepped forward when it was his turn to face the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Roberts. Beside Trump stood his wife, Melania, the former fashion model, who held two Bibles, Lincoln's and Trump's own. At the stroke of noon, the president-elect raised his right hand and placed his left on the Bibles. As he did this, Trump's family members and hundreds of political and government figures strained to see the moment. Trump and Pence were a study in contrasts. At age 58, Pence appeared trim, perhaps even athletic, and could have passed for a man 10 years younger. His jacket was neatly buttoned, his hands were clasped at his waist, and his smooth face was set in a half smile. Mere feet away, in sum, he resembled a small-town pastor, or maybe even a funeral director. Mere feet away, a stern-faced 70-year-old Trump stood with his coat hanging open like a caftan to reveal a long red necktie. Despite much cosmetic intervention, he looked old and tired. At the conclusion of the presidential oath, which had been voiced by 44 presidents before him, Trump said the words, "So help me God," and accepted the congratulations of those closest to him with a thin-lipped, toothless grin. He then delivered a 15-minute speech replete with distortions and falsehoods that were his trademark. He declared that America was awash with crime and despair and under constant attack. "This American carnage stops right here and stops right now," said Trump. It was the most remembered phrase of the address. That was some weird S-word, former President George W. Bush was heard to remark as he left the inaugural stand. Weird was the mildest word that one could attach to the 45th President of the United States as he launched an administration that would be stained by scandal and corruption so broad it defied a citizen's ability to grasp. Cronyism, secrecy, and nepotism would flourish. Presidential lies, daily cataloged by the Washington Post and others, would come at the rate of more than 150 per month. From the moment of his oath, Mike Pence, the vice president, faced the historic, some would say daunting, challenge of dealing with an erratic and undisciplined commander-in-chief. The book, The Shadow President, The Truth About Mike Pence.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice. Believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you. And boy, what a remarkable day. Several new studies and models now suggest that if Donald Trump had simply declared a national state of emergency, largely shutting down the country a few weeks earlier than he actually did, that tens of thousands, perhaps a majority of the people who have died would not have died. I mean, he certainly had the information available to him. Back in November, the federal government was warning Israel that this was coming. In December, they were producing reports and sending them to the White House. In January, he was getting explicit warnings. And in fact, Peter Navarro, his trade advisor, sent him a rather detailed outline of exactly what was going to happen. But the problem is that Donald Trump doesn't read. There's a piece in the New York Times about this today, the frustrations that the people in the intelligence community have in briefing him. He won't read briefings. He will look at pictures. He likes satellite images. He'll look at charts and graphs, but he doesn't have the mental capacity to translate them into meaning, into stuff that is actually consequential. He doesn't even read, memos from his staff. He doesn't read his speeches before he gives them, which is why he recites them so woodenly. Apparently, the only thing he reads is Twitter, and he doesn't read much of that because there's so much of it that doesn't like him. Trump may have some natural skills. You say, he's an idiot. Well, no, he's actually a very good salesman. He's a pathological salesman. He lies, which actually makes him a good grifter and a good huckster. So, he's got a natural gift there. It's why, back in the day when he was asked during the campaign in 2015, he was asked, who was his favorite author, what was his favorite book, and he said P.T. Barnum. Who famously said, I don't care what they say about me as long as they spell my name right. So if we look at the statements from his previous teachers and professors, they say that he had a mediocre or even poor intellect. So here's how banal, if that's how you pronounce that word, it's one of those words you read all your life and don't hear, or banal, I think it is. Our crisis is, our president is a man who is not particularly smart and never reads anything. I mean, it's shocking, but that's what it is. He gets all his news from billionaire Rupert Murdoch's propaganda channel, Fox News, which is famously filled with lies and scams. Meanwhile, billionaires like Betsy DeVos are funding groups pushing defiance of stay-at-home orders or mask wearing that saves lives. This feedback loop between Fox and groups funded by right-wing billionaires and Donald Trump has produced policies that have caused tens of thousands of American citizens to die unnecessarily. And I think, frankly, putting a billionaire in the White House while other billionaires are funding disinformation and misinformation groups, and another billionaire is running a national television propaganda channel, this could lead to as many as 250,000 dead Americans by the end of the year. So my question, do you think that history will remember this? Is history going to be kind to these oligarchs or not? I'm asserting that not. But, I think it's a reasonable question. Another one is, I was listening to a piece on NPR this morning about, how kids there's this crisis of mental health among our children. And I totally get that. But for context, or perspective, I guess would be the appropriate word, I mentioned at the end of the show yesterday that Phil Proctor sent out his newsletter. It's Planet Proctor, the May 15th edition. And I subscribe to it. It's free. You can just get on his email list. And he does this really nice. He's a comedian. He's one of the four guys who were the Firesign Theater. Two of them are still alive. Phil's one of them. And God bless him. He does good stuff. But just consider this. Imagine that you were born in 1900, in the year 1900. Right, 120 years ago. On your 14th birthday, World War I starts. On your 18th birthday, it ends after 22 million people have died. Later in that same year, the Spanish flu epidemic hits the planet and runs until your 20th birthday with 50 million people dead. On your 29th birthday, the Great Depression begins. Unemployment hits 25%, world GDP drops 27%, and that runs until you're 33 years old. The country nearly collapses. When you turn 39, World War II starts. You aren't even over the hill yet, and don't try to catch your breath, Phil writes, because on your 41st birthday, the U.S. is fully pulled into World War II. Between your 39th and 45th birthdays, another 75 million people perish. When you turn 50, the Korean War starts. and 5 million people die. At 55, the Vietnam War starts and doesn't end for 20 years, taking 4 million people in that crisis. On your 62nd birthday, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, a tipping point in the Cold War. Life as we know it on our planet might end. When you turn 75, the Vietnam War finally ends. And Phil says, if you were a kid in 1985 and didn't think your 85-year-old grandparent understood how hard school was and how mean the bully in your class was, think again. You know, they survived through everything listed above. It's just brilliant. Obviously, our children and grandchildren, depending on how old you are going to have wild stories to tell their children and grandchildren. We are living through a time that is genuinely historic and extraordinarily traumatizing. And, you know, I raised this issue a week or two ago in talking about the Kauai resilience study on children who had really, really miserable lives and in many cases suffered really severe abuse. These were migrant workers on Kauai, Hawaii, on the island of Kauai, except that they couldn't migrate off the island, but they were kind of the equivalent of migrant workers. They were sugarcane workers, or the children of sugarcane workers. And what they found was that while, yes, more than among the normal population were fragile, they also found that more than among the normal population were highly resilient, in about equal numbers to the fragile. In other words, the bell curve became more of a U, an upside down U curve. And, you know, with larger chunks on the fragile side and larger chunks on the resilient side. So there is opportunity as well as danger in all this. And there's opportunity to tell our children and grandchildren and friends and neighbors and everybody else, you know, yeah, it's really easy to see all the horror. Just like it was for our great-grandparents, you know, who might have been born in 1900, to have seen all the horror of World War I and then followed immediately by the Great Depression. Well, actually followed immediately by the Spanish flu epidemic, then followed immediately by the Great Depression, then followed immediately by World War II, and then followed immediately by the Korean War. And then we had, you know, 7 years of peace during the Eisenhower administration, and boom, it's off to Vietnam, right? We've been to hell and back. In the last century, America was. And many of us learned from it, many of us grew from it, and I think that in many ways our country learned and grew from it. What came out of the Great Depression and World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic was the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's policies, which returned optimism to America. And then, you know, LBJ continuing that tradition in the 1960s with the Great Society. Inventing out of, you know, literally creating from scratch Medicare and Medicaid, putting them into place, and all across the country. Everybody in America amending the Social Security Act by making this real. I mean, there's so much that we can look at and say, okay, you know, yeah, it's a crisis, but look what comes out of crises. So anyway, I just wanted to toss that out. I'll pick up your phone calls in a few minutes, actually. I also want to talk about what's happening here with the Trump administration, what's happening around the world with the statistics that we're looking at. So check it out. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be right back. Stick around. It's 15 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. Dennis in Aptos, California. Hey, Dennis, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
Yeah, hi. Well, we have a group here in the Santa Cruz area that defied the 11 to 5 beach ban last Friday, and they held a protest. Their leader is a guy by the name of David Rodriguez. He actually got on a radio station that has your show on from 4 to, I believe, 5 in the afternoon. So they don't have it on in the morning. But this was on yesterday. He was on K-Squid FM, and everything that came out of his mouth, he was a guest on this show, everything was disinformation and misinformation about COVID. Now, we've been very lucky in Santa Cruz in that there's been very few, a couple of hundred cases maybe, and 2 deaths. And one of the reasons is because we've had this lockdown all these weeks. We haven't met the criteria that Gavin Newsom has set to open more, but some businesses are reopening. It hasn't been a lockdown like in Spain or Italy where you can't even leave your house. You can go surfing and kayaking any time of the day. The 11 to 5 ban is meant to keep people from gathering on the beach and socializing on the beach. And, these people just decided, it was infringing their freedom and their right. This guy talked.
Dennis, do you know if there's going to be any effort to track these protesters and see if this became an outbreak center? I know California has put into place contact tracing. It seems like probably 2-3 weeks from now, we'll be able to look back, maybe even a week from now, we'll be able to look back and see if this became a hot spot. If there was one super spreader in that crowd, you might have 30, 40 cases that came out of it, and that might have spread into the community and become now 200 or 300 cases. And I suspect there's going to be a lot of these kind of stories, Dennis, where we look back and go, oh yeah, those were the guys who were in front of the Michigan state capitol, a couple of weeks ago, and now look at this, that kind of thing. I mean, we've seen this now documented with a couple of churches.
Well, I'll say one thing. I live in Aptos, and we have a grocery store about 2 miles from where I live. About 5 weeks ago, 7 people who work at that store tested positive. One of them got extremely sick. The store closed down for a little over a week, and then it reopened. So I guess David Rodriguez is totally ignorant of that fact, as he is of many facts, and that he, gave just all this
Dennis,
BS yesterday.
Dennis, I'm gonna stop this right now because Mr. Rodriguez is not here to defend himself, and I'm very, very uncomfortable with those kind of conversations. I was trying to put it in a more general context there for you so that we could, discuss it without trashing an individual person. But it's just, it's not something that I like to do on this program. I realize it's kind of the stock and trade of right-wing hate radio is to identify people and vilify them and trash them and all that kind of stuff. I've not found much value in that, frankly. I find that, calling somebody out, for example, Donald Trump or Kelly Loeffler, when they do so, public officials who do public things. But I don't know that much about your situation. I can't certify it. I can't validate it. I'm not going to let it continue. We'll be back. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. It's the Thom Hartmann Program. Stick around. Broadcasting live from Portland, Oregon. Sheltering in place, as it were. Stick around. We'll be right back. So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and there's a really troubling concatenation of events that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com.
People and all of this stuff came out of this very specific kind of Lee Atwater strategy in the 1980s. So you can find it over at thomhartmann.com and check it out.
Welcome back. Some other things in the news here. You'll recall that Richard Burr, the Republican senator, I believe he's from South Carolina, might be wrong on that. In any case, Richard Burr, the Republican senator, is the chair, or was the chair until earlier this week, was the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. The Senate Intelligence Committee unanimously released a report, unanimously. Richard Burr signed off on it, released a report saying that Russia not only interfered on our elections, but did so in measurable and consequential ways, and did so to the benefit of Donald Trump. They just laid that out. Kelly Loeffler, the Republican senator from Georgia, whose husband is the president of the New York Stock Exchange, his name is Jeffrey Sprecher, S-P-R-E-C-H-E-R, right after this story came out at the end of last month that Richard Burr and Kelly Loeffler had both been in an intelligence briefing where they learned that the coronavirus was really, really bad and we were going to have to shut down the country. This was a week or so before it happened. They were both in that intelligence briefing, and they both dumped all their stock virtually immediately thereafter, in the day or days immediately thereafter. And so you would think that they would both be being investigated for insider trading. But right after that report came out, Loeffler's husband gave $1 million to a Trump super PAC. Honest to God. He gave $1 million to America First Action, which is one of the major Trump super PACs. And now Richard Burr is being investigated by the FBI. They raided his home, they raided his office, they took his cell phone and his computers, and he has had to step down as chair of the Intelligence Committee. And Kelly Loeffler is still the Republican senator from Georgia. No consequence, no investigation, nothing. Tell me this doesn't stink. Meanwhile, what we're finding is that not only our state governments, we know now that Georgia is lying to us about deaths in their state, about COVID deaths in their state, and publishing false information on their state health department's website, and that sort of thing. Florida, Brian Kemp's Georgia, Ron DeSantis' Florida, doing the same thing, hiding information, refusing to release information on nursing home deaths and other things. Arizona now, Governor Ducey is doing the same thing. I'm convinced that the only reason he got elected in Arizona is that his last name is the same as the guy who was the host on Fox and Friends in the morning, and everybody figured he was his brother. And I have no idea if they're related or not, and maybe Ducey has a long history in Arizona politics. I just always figured he was, working on name recognition. If you're in Arizona, let me know. I'd love to know. But I'll tell you, I've been on Fox and Friends a couple of times, and those guys are not bright bulbs, shall we say. But anyhow, so we're learning that the various states have been lying about these statistics. Specifically, right now, what we know about, and also Nebraska and South Dakota have said they're not going to release statistics specifically or particularly about meatpacking plants. So, and they're not doing testing, and the testing criteria says that if you've ever been exposed, you don't qualify for a test. Rachel Maddow was going off on this last night. It's pretty mind-boggling. So we've got at least 5 red states that are lying to their people and to America about their statistics. Then on top of that, we discovered that this Brookings Institute just published an analysis of what little data we have. And what they found is that high prevalences of new cases, that's over 100 cases per 100,000 people, is happening on a county-by-county basis overwhelmingly right now in counties that Donald Trump won in the last election. Of the 176 counties that have seen an increase in cases, a significant increase in cases, 151 of them were won by Trump. Only 25 were won by Clinton. And the ones that Trump won, he won by an average 12% margin. 80 of those counties are in the South, 68 in the Midwest. 159 of these 176 counties are in outer suburbs. In other words, it's starting to move into the white semi-rural suburbs. And the Brookings Institution found that it's just a mess, basically. It's just a mess. And then on top of that, we discover that the CDC has been lying to us. This Brad Reed over at Raw Story, a new report from The Atlantic says that the Centers for Disease Control, quote, has been conflating results of two different types of coronavirus tests. You've got the virus test that tells you if somebody has an active infection, and you've got the antibody test that tells you if somebody's ever been exposed. And the CDC has been mixing these numbers together and representing them all as if they're active infections, or maybe representing them as if they're cured infections. I mean, the way that they're dealing with this data is impossible to make sense of. Ashish Jha, the director of the Harvard Global Health Institute, said of what the CDC is doing, "You've got to be kidding me. How could the CDC make that mistake? This is a mess." I suspect it's quite intentional.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So we'll be back with your calls after the break. Lord willing and the creek don't rise. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Today we're reading from Dorfman and Mallart's book, How to Read Donald Duck, Imperialist Ideology in the Disney Comic. And this is from the preface to the English edition. This book was first published in Spanish. To say that this book was burnt in Chile should not come as a surprise to anyone. Hundreds of books were destroyed and thousands more prohibited and censored. It was written in the middle of 1971, in the middle of the Chilean revolutionary process. Copper had been rescued, the land was being returned to the peasantry, the whole Chilean people were recovering the industries that during the 20th century had been the means of enrichment for Mr. Rockefeller, Grace, Guggenheim, and Morgan. Because this process was intolerable to the United States government and its multinational corporations, it had to be stopped. They organized a plan which at the time was suspected and since has been confirmed by Mr. Kissinger, Ford, and Colby to have been directed and financed by the United States intelligence services. Their objective was to overthrow the constitutional government of Chile. To realize their objective, an invisible blockade was imposed. Credits were denied, spare parts purchased for industrial machinery were not sent, and later the Chilean state bank accounts in the U.S. were blocked, and an embargo preventing the sale of Chilean copper throughout the world was organized. There were, however, two items which were not blocked: planes, tanks, ships, and technical assistance for the Chilean armed forces, and magazines, TV serials, advertising, and public opinion polls for the Chilean mass media, which continued for the most part to be in the hands of a small group which was losing its privileges. To maintain them with those of the U.S., their media prepared the climate for the bourgeois insurrection, which finally materialized some years later on the 11th of September, 1973. Each day, with expert U.S. advice, in each newspaper, each weekly, each monthly magazine, each news dispatch, each movie, and each comic book, their arsenal of psychological warfare was fortified. In the words of General Pinochet, the point was, quote, to conquer the minds, end quote, while in the words of Donald Duck in the magazine Dislandia, published in December 1971, coinciding with the first mass rallies of native fascism, the so-called March of the Empty Pots and Pans, the point was to, quote, restore the king. But the people did not want the restoration of the king, nor of the businessman. The popular Chilean cultural offensive, which accompanied the social and economic liberation, took multiple forms: wall paintings, popular papers, TV programs, motion pictures, theater, songs, literature. In all areas of human activity, with differing degrees of intensity, the people expressed their will. Perhaps the most important arm of this offensive was the work of the state publishing house, Quimantu, a word meaning sunshine of knowledge in the language of the Chilean Machupe Indians. In 2.5 years, it published 5 million books, twice the amount that had been published in all of Chile during the previous 70 years. In addition, it transformed the content of some of the magazines it had inherited from before the popular unity government and created new ones. It is in this multifaceted context, with the people on the march to cultural liberation, a process was also meant criticizing the mass cultural merchandise exported so profitably by the U.S. into the Third World, that How to Read Donald Duck was generated. We simply answered a practical need. It was not an academic exercise. For the Mad Dog Warriors on that September 11th, there were no paintings on the walls. There were only enormous stains which dirtied the city in memory. They, using the fascist youth brigades, whitewashed all the signing, many-colored walls of the nation. They broke records, murdered singers, destroyed radios and printing presses, imprisoned and executed journalists, so that nothing would be left to remind anybody of anything about the struggle for national liberation. But it was not enough to clean these cultural stains from the street. The most important task was to eliminate all those who bore the stain inside themselves, the fighters, workers, peasants, employees, students, and patriotic soldiers, to eliminate these creators of a new life, to eliminate this new life which grew, and for all that we created. This book, conceived for the Chilean people and our urgent needs, produced in the midst of our struggle, is now being published far from Chile in the uncle land of Disney, behind the barbed wire network of ITT. Mr. Disney, we are returning your duck, feathers plucked and well roasted. Look inside, you can see the handwriting on the wall, our hands still writing on the wall, Donald, go home. This is written in 1975. And then this from David Kunzel's introduction. The names of the presidents change. That of Disney remains. 46 years after the birth of Mickey Mouse, 8 years after the death of his master, Disney's may be the most widely known North American name in the world. He is arguably the century's most important figure in bourgeois popular culture. He has done more than any single person to disseminate around the world certain myths upon which that culture has thrived, notably that of an innocence supposedly universal, beyond place, beyond time, and beyond criticism. The myth of U.S. political innocence is at last being dismantled, and the reality which it masks lies in significant areas exposed to public view. But the great American dream of cultural innocence still holds a global imagination in thrall. The first major breach into the Disney of this dream was made by Richard Schickel's The Disney Version, The Lifetimes and Commerce of Walt Disney, the book How to Read Donald Duck.
So we've got a new video up over
Coming
at
up on the Science
ThomHartmann.com
Revolution
for
this
people
week,
who-
Dr. Michael Mann is here on heat, sea levels, Amazon. Oh my. Environmental scientist and writer Dana Nuccitelli drops by on Michael Moore's Planet of the Humans documentary. He explains how it peddles dangerous climate denialism. And journalist David Sirota is exposing the coronavirus cover-up. In Geeky Science, I'm discussing the importance of biodiversity and how the future of the Amazon may depend on tapir poop. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available.
Welcome back, Thom Hartmann here with
Support our
you.
program.
There's a
boy.
really
Are we
troubling
going to survive?
concatenation of
Billionaires
events
in the White House, billionaires in the cabinet, billionaires running television networks that spew propaganda, and if so, how long will it all last? It's incredible stuff. David in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Hey, David, what's up?
Hello, Tom. I was just got up this morning and curious, and I put on. I did a web search on ALEC, and they're having a convention in Orlando, Florida, on July 12th through 15th through the 17th. And one of the articles there, if you click on the link, it takes you to an article that says state leaders refuse federal funding. And then it has a list of the House of Representatives or your state officials that have signed on to this letter. So it's kind of a, we know who they are, right? The people that signed on from New Mexico, I would say, are they saying that the Navajo Nation can just get sick and die, or what are they saying? What kind of people are they? So public officials, Larry Scott and Jim Townsend, they are public officials. They're state representatives, and they've signed on to this letter. So we're just trying to let the public.
And the essence of the letter again is what?
It's state. It's refusal of federal bailout funds. if you agree with the refusal of federal.
Yeah, David, I don't know enough about that local condition to talk about. I thought you were going to talk about ALEC, a convention coming up.
I can't believe that there's not huge demonstrations.
Yeah, I can't speak to it without having more information in front of me. I'm sorry. Sean in Stamford, Connecticut. Hey, Sean, what's up?
Oh, hi, Tom. You were talking about trauma before, and one of the things that I noticed, having a psych background, is you're going to see a lot of people with conditions that have combinations of paranoia, agoraphobia, germophobia, and it's really going to be concerning because I saw something in the New York Times yesterday about people who were recovering from the COVID, and all of a sudden, their families and friends just ignore them. And there was one case of a kid who was 17, and his friends dropped him, and then he went for counseling. The guy's like, how could his friends just drop him like that?
All right.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because I've noticed this is the point I'm trying to make is that you're going to start to see a lot of people with mental health conditions that we didn't see before because of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're going to see a lot of people growing up actually more resilient than they would have been otherwise because they lived through something awful and survived and conquered.
That's true.
That part of the story typically is not told. But that's what happens when people grow up during a crisis. Go ahead.
Yeah, very true, very true.
Okay. Sean, thanks a lot. It's nice to hear from you. Bob in Naples, Florida. Hey, Bob, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I just want to say that history is not going to be kind to Trump and his administration, but they're shameless. They really don't care. As long as they're in power, that's all that matters to them. When CBS asked the question...
Sorry, Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, when CBS asked a question to William Barr, and the reporter asked her, she asked him, is history going to be kind to you, meaning to him or his administration? And Bill Barr's response was, history will remember us as the winners. That's all that matters to them, as the winners. Right. And then he kind of laughed. I mean...
Well, and Trump was once asked something like that, Bob, and he said, I'll be dead, I don't care. Or words to that
exactly. They're shameless, and their goal is they don't care, they cheat, they lie. I mean, whatever it takes. I mean, they're willing to throw their friends, and if they don't agree with them under the bus, they don't care. All they care is money, power, and that's all that matters. Just although when we study history, like Harding, Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Hitler, Franco, and Mussolini, they were in power because they cheated, and that's all they care. They have to kill that. So be it, and that's their weapon of the choice. That's all that matters.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Hoover was in power because he cheated, but I get your point, and that's absolutely what they're doing, and that's why Trump is screaming about Michigan sending out applications for absentee ballots, because he knows that if the majority of people vote, he's going to lose. And the bet that he's making right now is that in November, Republicans will be brave and fearless, and they'll go to the polling places, and Democrats are still going to be worried about getting COVID-19, particularly those people over 60 who are concerned about Medicare and Social Security, and they're not going to go out and vote. And so he's therefore going to win because he's got a bunch of younger white yahoos who are going to go and vote for him. So we'll see, Bob. But I think you're right. I think your assessment that history is not going to get to them, spot on. Dave in Manhattan, New York. Hey, Dave, what's up?
Hey, how you doing? You have spoken many times about how cynical Republicans are in that they don't necessarily believe, what they project, on online or on TV.
Sure.
And, they are opportunists, and this is about being prominent, making money, et cetera. But I always wonder, behind the scenes, what are they saying? I mean, if I were a fly on the wall or a fellow traveler and I said, oh, God, can you believe, what we're getting away with? Can you believe people are still believing all the nonsense we spew? Would they say that? I mean, are they, do they say, gee, I thought Trump was going to be bad, but I didn't think he was going to be this bad? Yeah, or are they just, I can't believe they're as self-deluded or as crazy as they might be, and that this is just It's just opportunism.
David Stockman talked about that. He wrote a book basically apologizing for the time that he was Reagan's budget director.
That's right.
And he made the point. I mean, George Herbert Walker Bush knew that Reaganomics was BS. He during the primary he called it out. He said it was voodoo economics. He said that he suggested, these weren't his exact words, but the implication or the import of them was that Ronald Reagan wanted to take America back to the Roaring '20s, the policies of Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, and those policies ended in disaster. Yes, they made rich people very, fabulously rich. That's why it was called the Roaring '20s, and they wiped out a lot of working class people. Working class wages actually declined in the 1920s, while rich people got richer, which is exactly what's happened since 1981. And so Stockman called that out and said, yeah, these guys know what's real, and they're BSing you on behalf of their donors. It's all about power and money. And I would bet that that's still the case.
Yeah, and I think that's worse. I mean, you can only blame somebody so much for genuinely believing something, no matter how nutty it is. But when they know it's not true and they pretend it is, I mean, that's just so destructive and objectionable.
It really is. It's hypocrisy writ large, Dave. You're absolutely right. Darcy in Tucson, Arizona. Hey, Darcy, what's up?
Hey, Tom. God, I love watching your show. I learned so much from you. I appreciate everything you're doing and, keeping us updated and stuff. You wanted to know about the governor of Arizona? Well, he is not related because the name is different, spelled different.
Okay.
Ducey, I don't know. I'm not a Republican, but obviously I didn't vote for him. But, yeah, it's spelled differently. And I also wanted to mention that I work in a hospital, and I work in the COVID unit a lot. And we have 8 to 10 patients in the COVID unit. Those are all positive. We have to put on the PPP every time you go into the different rooms. But they have us wear the same N95 mask as long as we cover it up for the whole shift. And then after the shift is over, they make us put it in a container, and they repurpose it, and then they give it back to us with our name on it,
they disinfect
to use it another time or whatever. But, we're short of everything. I mean, they pretty much divvy up all the masks for us. For the most part, we don't have a shortage of the gowns or the gloves or anything, or the shortage actually is only of the masks, all the different kind of masks that we have.
Are you concerned, Darcy, that Trump and Ducey opening up Arizona is going to mean that 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks down the road, you're going to see something like they were seeing in the hospitals in New York City?
Oh, yeah, definitely. As a matter of fact, I keep telling my husband, this is not going to end. And all my hospital coworkers, we know this isn't going to end. It's going to keep going on and on and on because these people just out there wanting to do whatever they want to do and no masks. And I don't like going anywhere I have to go to work, and I don't even like going there because of that situation. But you got to do what you got to do. You got to make that living. Both my husband and I are essential workers, and we both have to go out and make our living. But yes, I'm very concerned that Trump doesn't care about anybody but himself.
Apparently. Darcy, stay safe and keep us up to date on how you and your husband and the hospital and everything else is doing there in Tucson. Thank you so much for the call. It's great to hear from you. We'll be right back. It's 45 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Stick around. We'll be right back. 45 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. George in Portland. Hey, George, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I'm feeling like the grift and the lies and the corruption and the corporate takeover of our government is so complete at this point that the Republican Party is actually really proud of it. They're openly throwing it in our faces. And if they can own the libs, I think that's more important than the Constitution to the electorate. It's all about owning the libs. It's a game. They've made a blood sport out of it. Mitch McConnell obviously had a hand in that. And to your theory about the election, I feel like there's quite a bit of time between now and then for a lot of people to die. And despite the fact that, Republican voters are going to either die or lose loved ones, I wonder if they're going to start to realize that they've been had.
Yeah, we're 2.5 months since the first deaths here in the United States, and we're at 100,000, or will be shortly. I'm thinking by the end of the year, we're going to at least be at 250,000, and we might be at 500,000, depending on how extensively this whole, open the country back up thing, goes. And yeah, the Republicans are bragging about their corruption. You had, Mitch McConnell in the Senate saying, oh, if something happens to one of the Supreme Court justices, we'll replace them, Whereas, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it was like, oh, we can't do that in the last year of a presidency. You just can't do that. And it's just there, and then, Kelly Loeffler, dumping her stock and her husband dumping his stock. I mean, this looks like it actually echoed out beyond both her and Richard Burr. And there may be other members of Congress, same thing. And it's like, oh, yeah, no big deal. Hey, she gave us $1 million contribution. There's another story over on Raw Story right now about how one of the this guy owns a small company. He gives Trump a big contribution, and suddenly he gets a multi-million-dollar no-bid contract. And, no-bid contracts, you get to make as much as you want to make. So, I mean, it's just crazy. It's just crazy. George, thanks for the call. Raymond in Tacoma, Washington. Hey, Raymond, what's up?
Not much. I think history is going to be kind to Donald Trump if he wins the election, because the victor gets to write the history, and history is just
that was Bill Barr's point.
Everybody agrees. Yeah,
that was Barr's point.
So if he wins, then, as you said before, it's game over for America and our democracy.
Yeah.
But if he loses, then we get to write the history, and then we will put the facts and the truth out.
Although, Raymond, I mean, think back to the 1980s. Ronald Reagan was not a particularly popular president through much of his presidency. He had 2 major recessions. He had the largest stock market crash since 1929. He had major corruption scandals. It came out toward the end of his presidency that he had been involved in the whole Iran-Contra scandal that was clearly a felony, clearly illegal, impeachable offenses. And what happened was, after he went into, Alzheimer retirement, just vanished from the public view, a group of billionaires got together and created this thing called the Reagan Legacy Project. And they have now erected a statue to Reagan, or named a major building after Reagan, in every single county in the United States and every single country in the world. And they have been working aggressively, rewriting Wikipedia, rewriting history, so that, Reagan's history, the bad sides of Reagan's history are largely ignored. So I don't know if they'll be able to pull it off again. It's troubling. Raymond, thank you for the call. We'll be right back. It's 10 minutes, coming up on 10 minutes before the hour.
So we've got a new video up for regular supporters of our program over at ThomHartmann.com, and this is about just a totally bizarre story about these 3 guys with no VA experience, not even veterans, who are all big shots down at Mar-a-Lago, that Donald Trump has put in charge of the Veterans Administration functionally. And their association, one of them is the head of Marvel Entertainment, their association with Johnson & Johnson and the New York Stock Exchange, and Johnson & Johnson, the big drug company, taking this very, very cheap chemical, ketamine, tweaking the molecule a little bit, and rolling it as a new anti-suicide drug, Spravato, that in clinical trials caused 6 people to die, 3 of them by suicide, and none of the people taking the placebo to die. And now Trump is telling the VA, you have to buy this highly inflated price drug from Johnson & Johnson, and the Democrats want to know what's up with the VA crowd guys. Check it out. It's at ThomHartmann.com.
Thank you.
Is still legal in the United States. You have no rights if you've been convicted of a crime. We need to amend the Constitution. Check it out at ThomHartmann.com.
Oh, welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And Ed in Mansfield, Ohio. Hey, Ed, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing, Tom? Wanted to get your opinion. There's 4 senators that have allegedly dumped stock right after coronavirus meeting. However, as you said earlier, Richard Burr has been dealt with the most harsh. I'm wondering, the Senate Intelligence Committee came out with a bipartisan report saying, yes, Russia did interfere in the election, and yes, they did want Trump to win.
Right.
I think that's maybe why Burr has been targeted so heavily.
Oh, count on it. Count on it. That's the point that I was trying to make, Ed, is that Trump is going after Burr. He sent the FBI after Burr because Burr is now his political enemy, even though he's a Republican. And Burr is retiring, by the way, as well. So Trump doesn't give a rat's ass about the future of Richard Burr. So he's going after Richard Burr. But Kelly Loeffler, she's up for re-election in Georgia. She's not retiring. She may win that seat. Who knows? And her husband is the president of the New York Stock Exchange, and Trump has fantasies of someday the Trump organization going public and all this kind of stuff. So, and her husband gave $1 million to a Trump super PAC. So surprise, surprise, and it may well be one of these super PACs that's paying huge salaries to Trump and his kids. Again, so go ahead, Ed.
And you have Jim Imhoff, who's one of the biggest climate change deniers, who also has, skated scot-free so far. So.
Yeah, and then Dianne Feinstein was the 4th one that they were accusing, but she's actually a very, very wealthy woman. Her husband, I believe, is a billionaire, or at least a multi-millionaire. And she has a professional money manager who handles all her stuff, and she doesn't interact with him. So she's been able to demonstrate that, and nobody's suggesting, to the best of my knowledge, that Dianne Feinstein, was dirty in this thing. But it was just a lucky call or a good call on the part of her money manager. But that, that's the lineup. And the one guy who said Trump was put into office by the Russians, even though he's a Republican, is the one guy that the FBI is knocking on his door. It stinks. Yeah. Ed, thanks for the call. Doug in Phoenix. Hey, Doug, what's up?
Hey, Tom, how are you today?
I am great, but I'll get better, Doug. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I love that line. Hey, first of all, thanks for signing my baseball some 5 years ago, but moving on. Hey, we moved out of here like so many, moved out of Southern California to Phoenix, and we brought our mother-in-law with us. She's 90, currently resides in an assisted living home where it's, kind of closed quarters, for lack of a better term. There's absolutely zero testing going on, and I mean zero. Staff.
They're not testing the staff?
The staff only recently began wearing masks as of maybe a week ago. I suppose out of public shame, not policy.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of despicable, and they hide the numbers and don't tell us what's going on with the deeper nursing homes. There are numbers out there that they're not disclosing.
Yeah. Well, this is what we're learning.
It's really troublesome. I just thought I'd drop that in there that, kind of anecdotally we see it. And they don't care about those people.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, some of the, Trump the other day said that the people who are dying are the people who are at death's door, right? And in other words, we don't care about them, Trump was saying. Doug, thank you for the update. Yikes. Mary, and keep us up to date on how your mother-in-law is doing, Doug. Mary in St. Paul, Minnesota. Hey, Mary, what's up?
Yes, hi. I wanted to tell you that I was at a protest yesterday by the Minnesota Nurses Association, protesting that they're not getting enough. I'm sorry, the Minnesota Nurses Association, that they're not getting enough PPE. And we specifically talked to the ones that were working at Bethesda Hospital, which is where all of the COVID patients are going until they overflow to other ones. But anyway, they were saying that they have to use the same mask for 5 shifts. And also, the other thing that I talked to them about was chloroquine. They were giving it to people as kind of experimentally if they wanted to, but they stopped doing it because they were having to send too many of them over to different hospitals because they were having heart problems.
Wow. Yeah, that's that's the one known side effect of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine is that they cause what's called, I believe it's called long tail or long Q or something like that.
Long QT. Long QT.
Yeah. long QT.
Yep.
There you go. And
I have that in my
this
family.
puts people, right, and this puts people at risk for fibrillation and heart failure. Is that not correct? The electrical conductivity kind of heart failure as opposed to the artery or vein blockage heart failure?
Well, I can't comment on that. I'm not a nurse or a doctor myself, but I do believe that it is a problem with the electrical.
Yeah, it's an electrical signal problem, and apparently Trump is going to stop taking it. I guess after he admitted it, probably somebody sat down with him and said, "Really? Here's the science on this," and he's like, "Oh, I don't want to die." Okay,
I did not
and one
know
of the
that.
side effects is psychosis too. But how would you know? Right, Mary? I mean, if one of the side effects is psychosis and Trump takes this drug and he goes psychotic, how would you know that he's gone psychotic? I think he would just look like
You would
Ron.
never be able to tell the difference.
There you go. Exactly. Mary, thank you for the call. It's great to hear from you. We'll be back with more of our program in just a moment. Professor Richard Wolff is going to drop by right after the break. We're going to talk about the economy.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
So we've got a new video up for regular supporters of our program over at ThomHartmann.com, and this is about just a totally bizarre story about these three guys with no VA experience, not even veterans, who are all big shots down at Mar-a-Lago, that Donald Trump has put in charge of the Veterans Administration functionally. And their association, one of them is the head of Marvel Entertainment, their association with Johnson & Johnson and the New York Stock Exchange, and Johnson & Johnson, the big drug company, taking this very, very cheap chemical, ketamine, tweaking the molecule a little bit, and rolling it out as a new anti-suicide drug, Spravato, that in clinical trials caused 6 people to die, 3 of them by suicide, and none of the people taking the placebo to die. And now Trump is telling the VA, you have to buy this highly inflated price drug from Johnson & Johnson, and the Democrats want to know what's up with the VA crowd guys. Check it out. It's at ThomHartmann.com.
Thank you.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen. And so it is again now. Any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspect of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In this book, I focus on the economic aspects of socialism, how it differs from capitalism in broad outlines. I'm more interested in socialist critiques of capitalism and their implications about socialist alternatives than in the particulars of the few early experiments in erecting socialist systems, USSR, People's Republic of China, and so on, that history so far offers. Finally, my own education and work constrain me to concentrate on Western Europe and North America. Some important aspects of socialism are thus not covered or discussed here. Yearnings for better lives, such as socialism proposes, are not new. In slave societies, the slaves hoped and dreamed of lives less hard and less out of their own control. Their yearning aimed to obtain freedom. They sought social change that would preclude any one person being the property of another. In feudal societies, the serfs, free in the sense that no one owned them, yearned for better lives too. Their subordination to lords included heavy labor and other burdens that they wanted lifted. They hoped and dreamed of a society in which they would not be bound to the land, the lord of that land, and the feudal dues of labor and subservience. The serfs mobilized in the 1789 French Revolution to demand liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In effect, the serfs had expanded on what the slaves had called freedom. In the American Revolution against British King George III, the revolutionaries were neither slaves nor serfs. They were mostly self-employed farmers, craftspeople, and merchants subject to a foreign feudal kingdom. They wanted liberty as individuals to pursue their dreams without hindrance from feudalism or monarchism, whether foreign or domestic. They added democracy to the goals advanced by the slaves and serfs before them. The different systems of slavery, feudalism, and small-scale self-employment produced masses of people yearning for better lives. Eventually, each of those systems provoked revolutions. Many people then sought to break away from and go beyond those systems. The French and American revolutions marked key moments in the social transformations of major pre-capitalist systems into capitalist ones. By capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production in which the basic human relation is employer-employee instead of master-slave, lord-serf, or individual self-employment. The revolutionaries who wanted and built capitalism hoped and believed the transition to employer-employee relations of production would bring with them the liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy they had yearned for. The revolution's leaders promised to themselves and to the people they led that those goals would be achieved. But the transition to capitalist employer-employee relations that increasingly replaced the previous slave, feudal, and self-employment relations of production had unintended consequences. Capitalism soon proved to be different from what its revolutionaries had hoped. While it enabled some people to be more free and more independent than slaves, serf, or self-employed subjects of monarchies had been, it also seriously limited freedom, independence, and democracy for many. Capitalism betrayed many of the promises made by its advocates. It produced and reproduced great inequalities of income and wealth. Poverty proved to be as endemic as capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty. The capitalist rich used their wealth to shape and control politics and culture. Democratic forms hid very undemocratic content. The cyclical instability attending capitalism constantly threatened and hurt large numbers of people, and so on. Growing numbers of employees within capitalism began to yearn for better lives. They defined those yearnings first in the familiar terms of the earlier French and American revolutions: equality, fraternity, liberty, and democracy. They criticized a capitalism that failed to deliver those to most people and demanded social changes to achieve them. Many people still continue to want a better, softer, friendlier capitalism, where government regulates and intervenes to achieve more of what the French and American revolutionaries had yearned for and promised. They are also often self-defined as socialists. However, capitalism's development provoked another, different perspective that also called itself socialism. In that view, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had master slaves, feudalism had lord serfs, and monarchy had king subjects as their key sources of their inequalities, like freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production and capitalism generated parallel problems. Capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected. Kings mostly disappeared, but inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is our friend Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, author of numerous books. His most recent, Understanding Socialism, rdwolff with 2fs.com, also his website. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff, as in Professor Wolff. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program. I'm curious. I shared with you, I believe this morning, an article from Medium.com about this massive overhang of corporate debt. And there was an article in the Financial Times this morning about how companies, the Fed is just like, they're not only just buying, they used to buy treasuries. We've talked about this a couple times now. They used to buy treasuries, then they were buying investment grade corporate debt. Now they're buying junk bonds. And so basically every company in America, or at least every publicly traded company, is issuing debt, is issuing bonds that the Fed is buying, and it's keeping them afloat. It's like a backdoor bailout. How long can this last, and is this, $1 trillion+ of corporate debt? What kind of threat does that represent, not just to the corporations, but to America?
Well, I think it's a scheme. It's a game of desperate people in a panic mode. It has to be understood as that. No one should be fooled by government officials in ties and jackets acting as though everything is under control. Nothing is under control. That's why they're doing these things. But let's deal with the particular question of corporate debt. We've had now the third crash of capitalism in the 21st century. The dot-com crash in 2000, the subprime mortgage crash in 2008, and now the coronavirus crash. In each case, a weak economy was vulnerable to something which in other circumstances had never caused the crash before. So suddenly we have to face what is wrong with the economy. But that's a taboo topic in the United States and in most capitalist countries. You can criticize anything but not the economic system. So what do? Right. You don't question it. You don't change it. What you do is you print money. That's what they did in 2000. That's what they did after 2008. And that's what they're doing now. The only difference is the quantities of money being produced are greater than ever. And in order to get that huge amount of new money out of the box of the Federal Reserve and of the Treasury, you lower interest rates, which we know that they've done for 20 years now. Here's the problem. Every company, large, small, and medium, now has one way to solve whatever problems it has. Free money or virtually free money, interest rates close to zero. So every corporation, no matter what it wants to do, buy back its stock, give its corporate executives wild amounts of pay, go abroad, try a new technology, go into another line of business. Whatever its plans, its problems, they're solved by borrowing. So here we are, 2020, with our corporate sector so overloaded with debt that for many companies, they're called zombie companies, the debt they owe, the interest and amortization of their debt, is more now per year than the total net revenue they're bringing in from their business. They are technically bankrupt, even if they haven't gone through the process. This puts every company in an unbelievably vulnerable position, always on the edge of failure. So they're not going to hire the way they would if they weren't overloaded like that. They're not going to take any risks. You're in an economy that is slowly closing down, and the only reason people aren't focused on it is that the virus has made us close down even more dramatically, so we're losing sight of what this crisis is as it builds up.
So just to put this in terms that I think every American can understand, when you get your credit card bill every month, you have the choice between just paying the interest on the bill. Say you've got a $1,000 credit card balance, and you could just pay the $20 interest, or you can pay all $1,000 of it and not pay any interest, or you can pay $500 and pay interest, or whatever it may be, right? But those are your choices. But you got $1,000 on your credit card, but then you decide, hey, I'm going to live large. So you put $10,000 on your credit card, and now your interest payments are $200 a month. You can do that because you make $200, or you make $500 a month, let's say. But then you say, hey, let's go to $50,000 on the credit card. Now your interest payments are more than your paycheck. And all of a sudden, you can't even make your interest payments. And that's the point at which the bank goes, huh? A, have I characterized that correctly? And B, at what point do the banks that are, or the bondholders who are loaning these big corporations money say, wait a minute, this company, their cash flow is less than the amount of money that they owe us?
Absolutely. At that point, the bank realizes it can't go on funding this company. It is simply too risky. And then the company collapses. Could that happen? Yes, it is happening as we speak. But there are other dimensions that folks don't seem to understand. If the government is handing out free money to every corporation that's in over its head, which in this country is at least half of all the corporations, the rest of the world is going to say, you are cheating. Your government is subsidizing your corporations. And that's unfair competition with this British company, this Japanese company, this Chinese company. And those companies are not going to sit by recognizing that, for example, an American company that gets free money can drop its price a little bit and so outcompete a competitor from China or Britain or Brazil. They're not going to allow their government to sit by and do nothing. And so you're going to grow into a global crisis because this kind of funny money economic system that we are now in is unacceptable to the rest of the world. That's not the way capitalism is supposed to work, that every problem you have is solved by the government handing out free money. It also means, just to get the idea across, that the value of the dollar is now in great question as the world turns away from doing business with the United States, especially with a government which will not listen to the demands of not doing this kind of stuff. The rest of the world is not going to deal with the dollar anymore. It's too risky. They don't want to accumulate dollars. They don't know what a government that behaves this way may do to the value of the dollar with its behavior. And so you're going to see an atrophy of our opportunities abroad as the Chinese and the Europeans and the others turn more to one another and away from the nationalist thrust of what is going on here, both to handle the crisis and in all the other ways that the American government is withdrawing from a real engagement with the rest of the world.
It almost seems as if the Trump, and now, you've got Jerome Powell playing this game as well, which is, back when I thought he was an economist, was shocking. Now that I learned that he's an investment banker, well, I guess it makes sense. But it almost seems as if they're trying to kneecap our economy. Like this is some intentional plan to do as much damage to the United States as possible during the 4 years that Donald Trump is in the White House. Is that too paranoid or weird? Or, does the evidence support a conclusion like that?
I don't think so. I may be wrong and you may be right, Tom, but I think more the way it makes sense to me is, and I know this is scary, but I don't know how else to make sense of it. This is the end of a system. This is the kind of we're in trouble if we don't do something bizarre, we're in trouble if we do something bizarre, and it's a panic, and everything is a matter of days and weeks. This is what happens when systems run out of gas, when it's over. Capitalism has had a run for 300 or 400 years. It has nothing to be ashamed of in terms of its achievements. It has plenty to be ashamed of in the human cost of doing it, but that's true for all other systems too that we know of. And so I think these are signs of a much larger terminal kind of problem. Scary as that is, I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, and thus this is a time when we actually need leadership from people who do things like read.
And that's another symptom that we're in trouble.
Yeah, there you go. Professor Richard Wolff, thanks so much for being with us today. Good talking.
All right. Thank you, Tom.
Yep. See you next week.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Mike in Lomita, California. Hey, Mike, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, just wanted to amend that timeline you were quoting at the top of the first hour about the Spanish flu, so-called, and World War I. It actually appeared in the last year of the war and took a little dip in the summer and then came back with a vengeance in the usual flu season. There's a really good documentary on PBS that shows all the people celebrating the armistice wearing masks, because, of course, everyone was wearing masks to prevent spread of the flu back then.
Well, and Woodrow Wilson, when he went off to that signing ceremony in Europe, he got so sick that he was out for a week. I mean, they thought we may lose him.
Well, he had cerebral vascular issues, too, as we found out later. But in any event, flu was a big problem in World War I. In fact, some wags have said that instead of calling it the Spanish flu, we should call it Missouri Army-based flu, because
I thought it was Kansas.
Well, it's hard to say where, because, of course, they couldn't even detect the pathogen back then because it was viral and far too small for anyone to see under a microscope.
Right. But, yeah, it was a military base that was down the road from a giant pig farm, and or at least that's my recollection. I thought it was Kansas. Maybe it's Missouri, but I get your point, Mike. Spot on. Thank you very much. Mike, great to hear from you. Jerry in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Hey, Jerry, what's on your mind today?
Hi, what's on my mind today is the fact that Trump is going to be inaugurated at noon on January 20th by hook or by crook. And during the time when people have figured out that they have been disenfranchised, I think preparations for secession and or joining another country is inevitable, because this country cannot go on under this Constitution, which favors small states with low populations and the voter suppression. And I think it is high time to plan to leave the United States as a union, and the Northeast and the West Coast have got to make a plan in order to survive, because 4 more years of Donald Trump is not in the cards.
Yeah, but Jerry, there in New Mexico, you've got a Democratic governor, but you've got a Republican legislature. Any kind of, not even secession, any kind of cooperative pact to collaborate with other states.
I will be more than happy to pick up my marbles and move to California or Oregon or Washington or New York, because our state, many states will follow the lead if we have a secession movement.
Yeah, I get it. Jerry, thank you. Here's what I see has happened here, and I think it's worth just putting this on the record. You've got some right-wing billionaires, specifically in David and Charles Koch, but a bunch of people around them as well. Libertarian billionaires. Actually, I'll do this when we come back from the break. Stick around. We'll be right back. It's 19 minutes past. We're coming up on 20 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be right back with more right after this. More of your calls and news today. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. So Donald Trump has just deployed Patriot missiles to Iraq and pointed them at Iran. Has gone out of his way to threaten Iran, saying that they will pay a very heavy price. If any of their proxy groups, any of the Iranian-supported militias or groups, this is basically the Shiites, the majority of the population of Iraq. In Iraq, if any of them were to attack American forces, Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo will use this as an excuse to launch a war against Iran. This is insane. The New York Times is reporting military commanders, the Pentagon has ordered military commanders to plan for an escalation of American combat in Iraq, in the region, and, quote, prepare a campaign to destroy an Iranian-backed militia group that has threatened more attacks against American troops. We crippled their country with sanctions, and now we're threatening a war so that Trump can get reelected. There's a video about it over at thomhartmann.com for our supporters. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. greenhouse gas emissions have dropped a staggering 17%. I've told you about, Louise and I walking along the Columbia River, and, you see the big sky there, no skyscrapers and stuff around us, just, the river. And not a single contrail and not a single vapor trail, jet trail in the sky. A couple of days ago we were walking, there was one vapor trail way up in the sky. And normally, the sky's just crisscrossed with them. And and obviously it's not just jet travel, it's, factories shutting down, it's just all kinds of things. This study, a remarkable study, was just published in Nature Climate Change, in fact, the day before yesterday, found they looked at 69 countries that account for 85% of the world's population and 97% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And they said that there was a decline of over 1,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide through the end of April. And they could identify what was causing this. Aviation saw a 60% drop, cars 36% drop. Residential heating actually went up slightly, but only climbed by 3%. Power overall dropped by 17%, industrial power, by 7%, industrial power by 17%. Now, this is not likely to last. The world is kind of putting itself back together, but I think that we can probably reasonably assume that there will be another wave of virus deaths, and then there will be another wave of people kind of backing off, and it's going to take a couple of years to get through this, at least until there's a vaccine or anything like this. But by contrast, the International Energy Agency reported that emissions leveled off in late 2019, but they're actually dropping now. And, this is consequential. The UN annual emissions gap report said that global greenhouse gas emissions need to be cut by 7.6% per year in order to prevent disaster. And we are looking right now at a 17% cut, but it's not going to hold. So the question is, how much of a cut is going to come about as a consequence of the coronavirus infections all around the world? And then how sustainable is that cut? What lessons will we learn from this coronavirus experience, from the experience of sheltering in place, from the experience of having working from home and not having to commute to work? And which, by the way, it looks like it's going to be a more or less permanent long-term trend. Is the roughly 20% of small and medium-sized businesses that probably will never reopen, perhaps as many as 40% of restaurants and some other types of very small businesses may never reopen. To what extent are they going to be simply absorbed by the blob, by the giant monopolistic corporations that I write about in my book, The Hidden History of Monopolies? Or is this opening a space for new companies to come in and, like weeds through the cracks in the concrete, start new life? And if so, will it be new life that is done in a more sustainable way, where the people, who are working from home, where there's less of a carbon footprint? These are all really big questions. And one of the very simple and straightforward solutions to them, and this is like a real buzz in Europe right now. And China is moving in this direction very aggressively, but in the United States, it's become kind of an object of ridicule, tragically, at least among the cons, is that we might be able to rebuild the United States using green technology. You rebuild the country in a green way, rebuild the country in a way that uses less energy and that uses more renewable energies and gradually weans us off fossil fuels. And in that context, this is a great opportunity if we were to do that. Because, we've had, since the Reagan administration, basically, Reagan cut taxes dramatically, cut revenues to the federal government, and then stopped doing things like building new schools and maintaining roads and, rebuilding bridges and maintaining transportation and communications infrastructure. And as a consequence of that, we're not just rebuilding now as we go into this next era. We're not just rebuilding from the coronavirus destruction, the economic and infrastructure destruction caused by that. we're also rebuilding from the Reaganism destruction. We've had, this year it's a 40-year, or next year, early next year, it'll be a 40-year experience with Reaganism, experiment with Reaganism. And the experiment's done, in my opinion. It's been a disaster. The rich have got obscenely rich. They've gotten morbidly rich. And the middle class has gotten wiped out. It's actually shrunk. American family, we've seen a transfer of at least $7 trillion in the last 40 years from the bottom half of America to the top 5% of America. And, time to redo it, right? Time to restart it. Well, how about a Green New Deal? How about putting the country back together in ways that will sustain this 17% drop in emissions? And in fact, add to it, make the drop in emissions even greater. We can do this. Anyhow, back with your calls and the news of the day right after this break. It is coming up on 28 minutes.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Helping you win the Twitter wars, it's the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be right back.
Today we're reading from Dorfman and Mallart's book, How to Read Donald Duck, Imperialist Ideology in the Disney Comic. And this is from the preface to the English edition. This book was first published in Spanish. To say that this book was burnt in Chile should not come as a surprise to anyone. Hundreds of books were destroyed and thousands more prohibited and censored. It was written in the middle of 1971, in the middle of the Chilean revolutionary process. Copper had been rescued, the land was being returned to the peasantry, the whole Chilean people were recovering the industries that during the 20th century had been the means of enrichment for Mr. Rockefeller, Grace, Guggenheim, and Morgan. Because this process was intolerable to the United States government and its multinational corporations, it had to be stopped. They organized a plan which at the time was suspected and since has been confirmed by Mr. Kissinger, Ford, and Colby to have been directed and financed by the United States intelligence services. Their objective was to overthrow the constitutional government of Chile. To realize their objective, an invisible blockade was imposed. Credits were denied, spare parts purchased for industrial machinery were not sent, and later the Chilean state bank accounts in the U.S. were blocked, and an embargo preventing the sale of Chilean copper throughout the world was organized. There were, however, two items which were not blocked: planes, tanks, ships, and technical assistance for the Chilean armed forces, and magazines, TV serials, advertising, and public opinion polls for the Chilean mass media, which continued for the most part to be in the hands of a small group which was losing its privileges. To maintain them with those of the U.S., their media prepared the climate for the bourgeois insurrection, which finally materialized some years later on the 11th of September, 1973. Each day, with expert U.S. advice, in each newspaper, each weekly, each monthly magazine, each news dispatch, each movie, and each comic book, their arsenal of psychological warfare was fortified. In the words of General Pinochet, the point was, quote, to conquer the minds, end quote, while in the words of Donald Duck in the magazine Dislandia, published in December 1971, coinciding with the first mass rallies of native fascism, the so-called March of the Empty Pots and Pans, the point was to, quote, restore the king. But the people did not want the restoration of the king, nor of the businessman. The popular Chilean cultural offensive, which accompanied the social and economic liberation, took multiple forms: wall paintings, popular papers, TV programs, motion pictures, theater, songs, literature. In all areas of human activity, with differing degrees of intensity, the people expressed their will. Perhaps the most important arm of this offensive was the work of the state publishing house, Quimantu, a word meaning sunshine of knowledge in the language of the Chilean Machupe Indians. In 2.5 years, it published 5 million books, twice the amount that had been published in all of Chile during the previous 70 years. In addition, it transformed the content of some of the magazines it had inherited from before the popular unity government and created new ones. It is in this multifaceted context, with the people on the march to cultural liberation, a process which also meant criticizing the mass cultural merchandise exported so profitably by the U.S. into the Third World, that How to Read Donald Duck was generated. We simply answered a practical need. It was not an academic exercise. For the Mad Dog Warriors on that September 11th, there were no paintings on the walls. There were only enormous stains which dirtied the city in memory. They, using the fascist youth brigades, whitewashed all the signing, many-colored walls of the nation. They broke records, murdered singers, destroyed radios and printing presses, imprisoned and executed journalists, so that nothing would be left to remind anybody of anything about the struggle for national liberation. But it was not enough to clean these cultural stains from the street. The most important task was to eliminate all those who bore the stain inside themselves: the fighters, workers, peasants, employees, students, and patriotic soldiers, to eliminate these creators of a new life, to eliminate this new life which grew, and for all that we created. This book, conceived for the Chilean people and our urgent needs, produced in the midst of our struggle, is now being published far from Chile in the uncle land of Disney, behind the barbed wire network of ITT. Mr. Disney, we are returning your duck, feathers plucked and well roasted. Look inside, you can see the handwriting on the wall, our hands still writing on the wall, Donald, go home. This is written in 1975. And then this from David Kunzel's introduction. The names of the presidents change. That of Disney remains. 46 years after the birth of Mickey Mouse, 8 years after the death of his master, Disney's may be the most widely known North American name in the world. He is arguably the century's most important figure in bourgeois popular culture. He has done more than any single person to disseminate around the world certain myths upon which that culture has thrived, notably that of an innocence supposedly universal, beyond place, beyond time, and beyond criticism. The myth of U.S. political innocence is at last being dismantled, and the reality which it masks lies in significant areas exposed to public view. But the great American dream of cultural innocence still holds a global imagination in thrall. The first major breach into the Disney of this dream was made by Richard Schickel's The Disney Version, The Lifetimes and Commerce of Walt Disney, the book How to Read Donald Duck.
Coming up on the Science Revolution this week, Dr. Michael Mann is here on heat, sea levels in the Amazon. Oh my. Environmental scientist and writer Dana Nuccitelli drops by on Michael Moore's Planet of the Humans documentary. He explains how it peddles dangerous climate denialism. And journalist David Sirota is exposing the coronavirus cover-up. In Geeky Science, I'm discussing the importance of biodiversity and how the future of the Amazon may depend on tapir poop. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And Larry in Broken Box, Oklahoma. Hey, Larry, what's on your mind today?
Hey, good morning, Tom. It's Broken Bow, Oklahoma. But I was just going to add a little, yeah, no problem. I was just going to add a little information about the atrial fibrillation, with hydroxychloroquine. Basically, the main thing that it's concerned is you do get AFib. And what scares people like me and a lot of, is I have had it for 10 years, still do, is a threat of stroke more than heart disease. And it's a very, very severe concern.
So, in other words, if you, with AFib, take hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine, it will exacerbate your AFib, and it could cause your heart to throw a stroke at you.
Absolutely. Any kind of arrhythmia interruption like that is basically is confirmed can lead you into AFib, and a lot of people have this now.
Yeah, I actually, two friends of mine have gone through the ablation, I think they call it, where they go and burn a little piece of the heart away to solve it. They have gone through that successfully. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, that's true. Well, one other thing I was going to add to you, though, I was listening, moving forward in COVID, one of the things taking place here in Oklahoma is the Department of Human Services is moving to make a majority of their people go to remote work, period, and reduce costs of transportation and facilities. Because we're having budget problems like everybody else. So they're going forward, that's going to be a very real.
Oh, I think so, and not just in government. This is, I think that the next big crisis is going to be commercial real estate, because you've got a lot of companies that are just not going back to the office for a long, long time, if ever. So, excellent points, Larry. Thank you very much for the call. It's great to hear from you. Keep us up to date on how you're doing. Pat in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Hey, Pat, what's up?
Thank you. Considering Ivanka has a manufacturing empire in China and probably goes there often, surely there's a large contingent of security in wide and varied capacity. I suggest the virus outbreak was known much earlier. And isn't absentee voting mail-in voting? Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. And yes, absentee voting and mail-in voting are the same thing, although here in Oregon, that's all we have. We get a ballot in the mail, fill it out, send it in. In other states, you have to request it, then it comes, and then you do that. And that's like Michigan, for example. But yeah, yes to all of your points, and well said. Charles in Miami. Hey, Charles, what's up?
Hey, how you doing, Tom? Love your show.
Thank you. Not necessary to say. What's on your mind, Charles?
Well, no, I got to express how I feel all the time. But the thing that's bothering me is I just realized that, that the reason why my governor and a lot of red state governors want people to go back to work is I think they're scared that, they're going to have to pay into unemployment. And I just think with this Trump economy, do you think that would also drag his economy? I'm talking about Trump. Would this be, if this was a long-term effect, which we are looking at, because as we know, if they're sending us back to work and there hasn't been a fall in the numbers. In fact, it's the opposite. So at this point, would it be a drag on his economy? I'm talking about Trump.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Trump is caught right now. He's stuck between a rock and a hard place because his only, in his mind, the only way he can get reelected is if, quote, the economy is good. Also in his mind, because he has never worked a day in his life as an employee of somebody else. He was born with his father was a multimillionaire and he worked for his father's insurance or little real estate empire there in Queens as a kind of slumlord, which was the Cushing family too thing. They were slumlords, but Trump worked his way up out of that, I suppose you could argue. But the bottom line is that he thinks that the only metric by which you measure an economy is the stock market, and so he's got Jerome Powell, as we were talking with Richard Wolff about, juicing corporate debt so that these corporations, so that their stock prices don't collapse. And it's setting the country up for a collapse. It's going to be a disaster. And there's no way out of this. If he'd just been honest with people and said, we're going to go through a hard time, it's going to last a couple of years, do everything we can to save lives. If he had talked like Angela Merkel or Macron, their people are forgiving them. Even Boris Johnson is being forgiven somewhat, although a lot of that is because he himself got sick. But, the bottom line, people need to understand that this ain't going away this year, and Donald Trump doesn't get that, and he's placed all his bets on that. I think he's going to lose badly. Charles, thanks for the call. Tony in Miami. Hey, Tony, what's up? What's on your mind?
How are you, sir? Me and my girlfriend love your program. Since we started watching it a few weeks ago, we just can't stop watching you. But I'm an immigrant. I came to this country back in the 1973 when busing started. Mm-hmm. And I was the only guy in the American history class that got A. The teacher made me walk to the blackboard and made the whole class bow down to me. But
wow. That's great.
I have a very interesting history, but you're tired. What do you say to people that are tired of incremental change? You had this congressman on yesterday, which he was saying, we don't want people to go in the street, and I'm not talking about violence, but some sort of a movement, people get in the street and start demanding their rights. But it's just like gun control. Let me tell you about gun control. Americans get all excited They get all sad. They light up candles for 2 weeks, and then they forgo. Everybody goes about their business and their rat race and forget about it.
Yeah.
What do you say to people that lost hope in the system?
What I say is, Tony, if you look at the history of the United States, and I'm guessing you can probably look at the history of any other country as well and see something very similar, what you find is that the thing that actually provokes change, system-wide change, the kind of real deep actual change as opposed to incremental change that you're talking about, Tony, is crisis. And, whether it was the Arab oil embargo in the late 70s and Iran taking our hostages, the story I'm sure you're familiar with, that created a crisis that allowed Ronald Reagan to step into that and flip us from Keynesian economics into Reaganomics, or whether it was the last Great Depression in World War II, which brought us the New Deal and a complete transformation in our political system, or whether it was the great crisis of the Civil War that brought the end of slavery and essentially a new economy, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, or the crisis of a worldwide depression in 1770, combined with England giving a massive tax cut to the East India Company so that they could wipe out all these small tea shops up and down the East Coast in what was then the American colonies, that provoked the Boston Tea Party and the American Revolution. Crisis is what provokes an opportunity for change. And there's a huge competition right now between the Betsy DeVos, Rupert Murdoch, billionaire class, who are working very hard, and Charles Koch and whatnot, who are working very hard to turn America into a libertarian nation where there's no regulation. This is what Trump did yesterday or day before yesterday with his executive order, saying to every regulatory agency in the government, feel free to do away with anything you want, basically. If you can justify it economically, that's fine. You don't have to count lives anymore. So
yeah, I used to work for
on the right. No, let me finish, Tony. On the right, you've got these people who understand this, and they see this as an incredible opportunity to cement their ownership of America and turn America basically into a neo-fascist libertarian state. And then on the left, you've got, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and people like that, Elizabeth Warren, who are saying, no, this is an extraordinary opportunity to revive the New Deal, to bring back Keynesian economics, and to even, move away from classic, neo-feudal capitalism into cooperative, co-ops and things like this, a new form of economy. And frankly, I think that which side is going to win is going to be decided on November 3rd. To you, Tony.
I hope so. I definitely, I don't want to lose hope. My family been coming to this country the last, I don't know how many thousands, hundreds of years coming here. Mm-hmm. They just love this country. They see the opportunities. My dad came here before the revolution, which was the biggest American blunder. They did support the Ayatollahs. And
before the Iranian revolution, you mean? Yeah.
Exactly. And I do come from a crisis. I'm scared of the revolution in Iran, which it just turns everything to chaos, and then you don't know who's the right guy, and you get somebody like Ayatollahs taking charge. Yeah. That's why I'm
and that's the possibility if Trump wins re-election. I mean, you've got a bunch of theocrats who are behind Trump. Falwell and all these guys. It's incredible. Tony, thank you for the call, and thanks for your perspective. It's great to hear from you. It's 45 minutes past the hour. We'll continue with your calls right after this, and thoughts on, will democracy survive Trump? How is history going to judge this? And perhaps more important than Trump, although he's one of these, he's a so-called billionaire, but he's one of these guys who considers themselves the oligarchy. Will history think well of the rest of
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Or how will history judge this current crop of billionaires? We look back on the late 1800s, the robber barons. We don't think that much of them. And welcome back. James in Spokane, Washington. Hey, James, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. How are you today?
Good.
Let me say first, oftentimes I've heard you mention the foreigners laughing at us, and they do. We're absurd, but that's when they're awake at their cocktail parties. When they're asleep, we haunt their dreams. We've got a monkey in there with access to the nuclear launch codes and ICBMs. You know, it's got to be a nightmare for them.
A good point. Yeah.
But as far as you mentioned purging, like the GOP and our politics and whatnot, that's happening in the form of the COVID-19. You know, our system was not going to get these guys out of there. This thing is irredeemable. This is a universal dictate. Okay, this is our one great hope.
Yeah. Well, it's the world's one great opportunity, I would say. I don't know about hope, but you know, we're
seeing, haunting their dreams. Their nightmares are full of us.
Yeah, I get it. Yep, excellent point, James. Thank you. Chris in Portland. Hey, Chris, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I listen to you weekly. First time calling in. Can you hear me okay?
Just fine, Chris. What's up?
Okay. I just want to invite you, if you get a chance, to check the globalresiliencesummit.org out. I don't know if you have.
Okay.
In terms of the new Green Deal, in terms of great opportunities, this is a one way to listen to some of our indigenous leaders who are talking about, just like what you're talking about, ways to go forward in a whole new way. The hemp economy is being talked about. The new Green Deal. There's some, solar being made on reservations. A woman, Winona LaDuke, I think she ran with Nader at one point in the 90s, maybe?
Yeah.
For vice
she
president.
was his vice presidential candidate in 2000 for president.
So she's one of the speakers in this summit. I mean, you could go to the website right now and
I am looking at the website right now. It looks to me like this is more, the kind of event that, festival and event people put on, where you get a bunch of, well thought of presenters and they do their presentations and people pay to listen. You can register now and get 3 free videos. But this is not like, governments getting together. This is a private enterprise. Which is not to diss it. But, at first I thought you were talking about, that there was some big governmental organization or group or something that I had missed. But I get you.
I think this is alternative ways of going forward, kind of, more sustainable in harmony with nature. Sure. So that was it.
Yeah, I see Bill McKibben is one of the speakers, and there's some good people here, some genuine. I know a couple of these people, and it sounds like it would be fascinating. Flexible 48-hour access. Huh, interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Go ahead.
You're welcome. I think, identifying the problem is great. I think going forward and spending more time on solutions is super important. Thanks for everything that you do.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you, Chris. Nice to hear from you. And thanks for the heads up on the globalresiliencesummit.org. We'll be right back. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. Hey, Thom Hartmann here. I have a new book out. It's called The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream, and Ralph Nader wrote the foreword. It's available for pre-order wherever you find fine books. So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and there's a really troubling concatenation of events that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Bobby in Lafayette, Indiana. Hey, Bobby, what's on your mind today?
Oh, I just think the people need to know some of the stuff that's going on with these large companies. They're using the coronavirus as an excuse to get rid of a lot of their older workers. I myself just got terminated from a large company. Been there 20 years. I'm a certified welder. We took a mandatory 2-week furlough. Come back, I worked 6 hours. Called in the office, and the first thing they say, due to the coronavirus and the rearranging of the shifts, give me your card, you're terminated, go home.
Wow. And you think that they're using the excuse that as an older worker, you're more vulnerable to die from this, and therefore the company might have some liability as an excuse to purge the older workers who presumably are paid more than the younger workers who are just coming in?
Yes, exactly. Think about it. How much liability are they losing, these older workers like myself? High blood pressure, medical issues. Oh, we can get rid of him because of Corona now.
Yeah.
And there's other workers in the same company. One been there 28 years. One been there 32 years. Called in the office. Due to Corona and the rearranging of the shifts, give me your card, go home.
Amazing. Bobby, I'm so sorry to hear that. And, I wish you the very best. I don't know what to say beyond that, but, I think you're right. I believe that you're absolutely right. Bobby, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Lou in Torrington, Connecticut. Hey, Lou, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. It's good to talk to you again. A short time ago, I heard Trump. He was leaving for somewhere, I forget, but they mentioned the mail-in voting, and it looks as though he's going to push back on that. So I have this idea. I don't know what you would think of it. Have you ever seen the nurses in the hospitals? They walk around with these mobile computers, outside of every room, they wheel them around. Why can't we have a drive-through voting with these pads right there, right next to our doors on the car, and you just stick your hand out the window and vote? I mean, if they won't do the mail-in, maybe the drive-through would be another alternative.
Yeah, the problem is they have to check you in. They have to compare you with the list. There's a little song and dance that has to be done first, particularly in the states that have made it really hard to vote, where you've got to show ID and you've got to, all this kind of stuff. And that would make it very vulnerable to weather. Having long lines of cars and things. It's not a terrible idea. I can tell you, though, for 22 years here in Oregon, this state has been voting by mail. Louise and I lived here for I don't know how many years before. I think it was around 5 years. Then we moved to D.C. for 7 years, and we've been back here for 3 or 4 years. And it's just wonderful. I've voted in several elections now by mail. I just voted in our primary by mail a few weeks ago, and the results came out Tuesday of this week. And it's so easy. It's so convenient. You get the information. You get a little booklet that tells you where the candidates can write up their little sales pitches, and it's just very straightforward. We really need to be seriously thinking about moving towards something like that. Lou, thanks a lot for the call. Mary in Chicago. Hey, Mary, what's up?
Yes, I called them because I've seen this playbook before. I became of a voting age when McGovern was running against Nixon.
Yeah,
I've seen the storybook before, where, there was a lot of racial, and social unrest, and to see somebody, like Trump, open the scars of, racial division again.
Well, Mary, remember who were Richard Nixon's two principal advisors. Roger Ailes, who went on to found Fox News Network with Rupert Murdoch's money, and Roger Stone, who is Trump's best buddy and one of his principal advisors. So it shouldn't surprise us that Trump has reprised Nixon's silent majority and Nixon's "I'm the president. If I say it, it means it's not illegal," and all this other stuff. It shouldn't surprise us at all. But I agree with you. We are seeing history repeat itself.
Yes. So I think a large segment of the public has really caught wind as to how blatant this behavior has become. So I think people are pausing and say, "Whoa, I didn't sign up for this,"
Yeah, I'm with you, Mary.
I think the opportunity is there, if we get our act together and organize. And
the challenge. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mary. Your last sentence.
Yes. So I think the challenge is to organize ourselves. I belong with a seniors group that is pretty grassroots.
That's great. That's great. Mary, I got to move along, but thank you for the call, and thank you for watching us on Free Speech TV. We will be back with more of our program. We got a great guest right up the top of the news. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and there's a really troubling concatenation of events that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com.
For our Thom Hartmann Book Club excerpt today, we're reading from Ed Morales' new book, Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico. This is from the first chapter. There was never any doubt that the United States wanted Puerto Rico for its own when it began a war with Spain near the turn of the 20th century. Cuba had been in the throes of independence war with Spain off and on since 1868, and the conflict that began in 1895 seemed ripe for the United States to capitalize on. The sinking of the USS Maine, an American naval ship destroyed by an explosion while moored just outside Havana, fueled American entry into the war. Although there are conflicting theories about the source of the explosion, including the likelihood it was caused by a spontaneous internal fire, William Randolph Hearst's newspaper chain blew up the incident into the perfect catalyst for the United States to enter the conflict. When Theodore Roosevelt entered the fray with his army of Rough Riders, the whole affair came as no surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention to the lust U.S. government leaders and military had long expressed to expand southward and westward. And although the idea of manifest destiny was at the forefront of the political discourse of this period, it's less often observed that the United States' expansionist gaze was saturated with racial language and attitudes, at once desirous of and repelled by Latin America's mestizo mulatto social dynamic. The Haitian Revolution at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th created a U.S. obsession with both Cuba and Puerto Rico because of the potential of a similar black-led revolt on those islands. In 1826, Virginia Senator John Randolph feared that such a revolt would render the southern United States vulnerable to invasion from Cubans in rowboats. For this reason, he objected to the United States participating in the 1826 Panama Congress because American diplomats would have to endure the horror of a U.S. diplomat taking his seat in the Congress, quote, beside the native African, their American descendants, the mixed breeds, the Indians, and the half-breeds, without any offense or scandal at so motley a mixture, end quote. The logic driving this perspective underlined not only the importance of slavery to the emergence of capitalism in the 19th century, but also, as Matthew Karp points out in this vast southern empire, the extent to which slave owners and their elected representatives disproportionately shaped U.S. foreign policy. Going back as far as the Haitian Revolution, fear of a successful slave rebellion in the newly formed United States strongly motivated Southern politicians. As Karp mentions, to that end, Presidents Madison and Monroe, quote, used overwhelming force to destroy black maroon settlements in southern Florida, end quote. Fear of slave rebellions also briefly united the interests of American slaveholders and Cuban elites who wanted independence from Spain, but in the late 19th century, after abolition, Roosevelt's forces fought in conjunction with Afro-Cuban armies against their common Spanish foe. The move to wrest Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain came just as Spain had finally relented to end slavery as a concession to black rebel Cuban armies that had formed to push for independence. In a further move to placate continued unrest on the island, in November 1897, Spain signed automatic charters for Cuba and Puerto Rico, which gave limited home rule governments to both islands. Puerto Rico would gain full representation in the Cortes, the Spanish parliament, and could veto Spanish commercial treaties unfavorable to them while also retaining the rights to set tariffs on imports and exports. In this way, Puerto Ricans were granted a kind of citizenship that allowed self-government grafted on what was left of their Spanish subjecthood. Yet on July 25, 1898, 8 days after the first meeting of the newly formed Puerto Rican Parliament, U.S. troops arrived in the southern port of Guanica and replaced the Spanish flag with the stars and stripes. This date would be remembered over 50 years later when the United States finally followed through on a project to allow Puerto Ricans to have limited autonomy and self-government. But at the time, it was both the end of Teddy Roosevelt's splendid little war and the beginning of the current quandary over what exactly Puerto Rico's new colonial master would do with the island. Although historians agree that there was no pre-existing plan for designating Puerto Rico's status, there was a general belief that Puerto Rico could be incorporated as a U.S. territory and probably would be. This led many to assume that it would follow a similar path to statehood as former territories like Florida and Louisiana. At the very least, it would, by acceding to military control, receive, quote, the advantages and blessings of enlightened civilization, end quote, as Puerto Rico's first military governor, Nelson A. Miles, declared 3 days after the landing of Guanica. Because Cuba was so militarized during its wars for independence, the United States decided to allow it national sovereignty, thinking it could still exert considerable control over the economy because of existing business interests and a ready-made set of Cuban consumers who were already buying Ford Model Ts. But although Puerto Rico had experienced anti-Spanish uprisings in the mid-19th century, in 1898 they did not have nearly the same level of armed mobilization present. So the United States held on to it, particularly because of its geographic location, which would provide the United States with a stronghold on the easternmost tip of the Caribbean. The book is Fantasy Island by Ed Morales.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So the fossil fuel industry seems hell-bent for leather on extracting every single dollar out of what they've got in the ground and every single dollar out of us and to hell with the planet as long as there's riches to be made, and the banksters are gung-ho to help them. Ben Cushing is on the line with us. He's a campaigner with Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign of the Sierra Club. SierraClub.org, of course, is the website. Ben's Twitter handle, Sierra Club, of course, at Sierra Club. But Ben's is BM Cushing, Cushing. Ben, welcome to the program. Tell me about this. JP Morgan Chase?
Yeah, great to be with you. Thanks for having me. JP Morgan Chase is the world's largest funder of fossil fuels. The Sierra Club and our partners put out an annual scorecard every year called the Banking on Climate Change Report. And year after year, it has shown that JP Morgan Chase far outpaces all other commercial banks in the world in its financing of the coal, oil, and gas industries, which makes it one of the primary drivers of the climate crisis.
Now, this is the bank whose CEO is Jamie Dimon, right? Am I remembering correctly?
Exactly, yeah. Jamie Dimon is the CEO, and notably this week, JP Morgan Chase just held its annual shareholder meeting, and one of the key votes there was on another leader of the bank, Lee Raymond, who has held the role of lead independent director at JP Morgan Chase.
Wait a minute, Lee Raymond used to be the president of ExxonMobil.
Exactly. Lee Raymond, former ExxonMobil CEO and one of the chief architects of the climate denial and deception campaign. He's been on the board of Chase for over 3 decades. He's been in the lead independent director role for nearly 20 years, which means he's only second to Jamie Dimon in his power on the bank's board. This has been a fact that's gone little noticed for a long time, but this year there was a tremendous campaign to pressure Chase to remove Lee Raymond from this role in light of Chase's role as the world's largest funder of fossil fuels, and to kick Lee Raymond off the board. His role was actually demoted in response to that pressure. Although he's not been removed from the board entirely, Chase has removed him from that lead independent director role and signaled that he will be transitioning off the board in the near future. And so that's a big win for activists and investors that have put pressure on the bank.
Yeah, I remember when he got this mind-boggling, I think it was over $100 million golden parachute when he left ExxonMobil. It was just incredible. I had no idea he had a side gig here with JP Morgan Chase. But Jamie Dimon presents himself as a liberal. He's been talking about, we need to care for the average working person. And, he's a big advisor to Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Has he been just BSing us all this time?
Well, JP Morgan Chase, and as well as many of the other major U.S. banks, do often talk a good game on climate change and, all signaled their support of the Paris Agreement when that was signed in 2015. But if you actually look at their investment portfolios, their actions do not match their rhetoric, and certainly the investments that the bank makes does not match with Jamie Dimon's professed concern for climate action. In the years since the Paris Agreement was signed, just in those 4 years, JP Morgan Chase has funneled about $269 billion into the coal, oil, and gas industry. And that's significantly more than any other bank in the world. But this is a problem that really is actually centered around the big U.S. banks. The Banking on Climate Change report looks at banks from all over the world, and the 4 largest bankers of fossil fuels in the world are JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citi, Bank of America. Those are all U.S. headquartered banks, and they are the 4 largest funders of fossil fuels in the world. And That's so amazing. Certainly their actions and investments do not match their rhetoric.
To what extent is that because they are funding fracking in the United States? There's been this absolute over the last 20 or 30 years, but particularly since Halliburton really took this to scale in the late 1990s and early 2000s. That fracking has just exploded, and if fracking is a big piece of that, with this collapse in demand for fossil fuel products as a result of the coronavirus. I don't know what percentage of fracking is producing oil versus gas, and I'm assuming that a lot of that gas is going to residential heating. But how at risk are these four big American banks as the small fracking companies, there's literally thousands of them in the United States, are going bankrupt?
Yeah, absolutely. This is large, in a large part being driven by the fracking boom over the past decade, and certainly that fracking boom has been propped up by Wall Street, really providing endless amounts of capital and easy access to lending in order to support that unprofitable business. And it is important to note that over the past decade, fracking has never been a profitable business. Companies use neat accounting tricks to continue going from well to well, even when those are not profitable. And the easy access to capital and lending from big Wall Street banks has enabled them to do so. JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo are actually the two largest bankers of fracked oil and gas in the world, as shown in the Banking on Climate Change report. And so, yeah, that's a big part of it. Those two banks have really been at the center of fueling.
So to what extent is this presenting a crisis to these banks?
Yeah, well, JP Morgan Chase actually noted in one of its recent financial filings that it was prepared to write off several $1 billion in losses from oil and gas loans were not going to be repaid. So it's already starting to hurt some of these big banks that are way too leveraged in the.
And hopefully they're thinking the same thing. Although they're probably thinking, oh, it'll come back. Everything, happy times will be here again. We're talking with Ben Cushing with the Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign of the Sierra Club. And Ben, what is the call for action that you are putting out to the members of the Sierra Club? Is it, move your accounts away from J.P. Morgan Chase and these other three big banks that are financing fossil fuels, or is it a call to shareholder activism, or is it, what specifically? What's your takeaway here? How do you want people to react to this?
Yeah, well, I do want to note that although these big banks are continuing to finance huge amounts of fossil fuels, there have been some recent wins that are important to note. So we've been working with indigenous leaders in Alaska over the last couple of years to pressure all of these big banks not to finance drilling in the Arctic and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge specifically, which was opened up a couple of years ago by Republicans to drilling for the first time. And so we've been advocating for these big banks to not fund Arctic drilling and to stay out of the Arctic refuge. And actually, just in the last few months, we've actually seen great success and a lot of momentum on that effort. So Goldman Sachs, Citi, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley have all taken action. And now Bank of America is the only big U.S. bank that has not taken this step. And so we're asking Sierra Club members and activists all over to send a message to Bank of America to not fund Arctic drilling as well.
You got it. Ben, we're out of time, but great work you're doing there with the Sierra Club.
This
Hang on just a second.
Is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Thank you.
Ben Cushing, the campaigner with the Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign. Thanks, Ben. Great talking with you.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Cassandra in Camas, Washington. Hey, Cassandra, what's up?
Hi. I just wanted to pass on a little information I just learned from another radio station program, Flashpoints, with Dennis Bernstein, who's doing it out of San Francisco at the moment. Anyway, he had on Chase Iron Eyes, who is a Sioux representative from South Dakota, who is going up against the South Dakotan governor, who is trying to have their checkpoints, the Sioux checkpoints, taken down. And she's been threatening, as we all know, for the last week or so, to bring legal procedures against them. Anyway, Chase Iron Eyes is very upset right now because apparently there is now a group of people calling themselves, and it's the swastika toting, gun toting, wearing, but all that. They're calling themselves the Trump Liberation Army, and they are threatening to take down the checkpoints by force. Whoa. And so this is ramping up. And I didn't know if you could check into this and maybe find out more about it. But this is frightening because that would actually, that would be something that needs to be reported. That could be a first shot of basically Trump's brown shirt thugs, in this case, his little Trump Liberation Army is what they're calling themselves. That's obscene.
Yeah, this is how it started in Germany in the early 30s. Right. Cassandra,
I just wanted to pass that on.
Yeah, if you go over to ThomHartmann.com, Sean, my executive producer, her contact information is over there. You can send her a note if you have any contact information for any of these folks, or if anybody does who's listening.
I wish I did. I don't. I just heard this on Dennis Bernstein's Flashpoints program just this morning, so I wanted to pass that on.
We'll make a note and see what we can learn about it. Cassandra, thank you very much for the call.
Thank you.
Great to hear from you. Thanks. Elizabeth in Eau Claire, Michigan. Hey, Elizabeth, what's up?
Well, I just have a couple of comments. When you were talking about Reagan, it came to my mind. When Carter was president, he put solar panels on the White House. When Reagan came in, he hurried threw them out. And I remember reading an article back in the 90s about it was the waste of government, which has always been there and always will be probably, where we're paying all this money to store them in some building somewhere. And it made me think about why isn't certain buildings, little by little, transferring them from whatever god-awful old-fashioned heat that they have, why aren't they going to solar and wind, at least starting out in our government buildings to make, we're paying their bills. So why aren't they doing that? Reagan did it just probably because he was a denier of a lot of stuff, too. And the other thing I'm curious about that maybe you can make clear, I've heard all this about the post office for years. Is this a legislative thing? Why can't they fix this thing about the hundreds of millions or however many millions or billions of dollars that they're paying decades ahead for the retirement thing? I'm not real clear about that, but why is it the legislature just can't fix it?
Here's very quickly, Elizabeth, here's the timeline on this. In 2005, the post office came out and did a whole big song and dance about how they were going to start rolling out electric vehicles and hydrogen-powered fuel cell vehicles. And this was and they've got the largest vehicle fleet in America, and this was going to revolutionize America's relationship to vehicles. Within a year, the Republicans have put together a plan to require the post office to set aside $5 billion a year for the next decade to pay for the health benefits of people who retired 75 years from then. And it's kneecapped the post office. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at ThomHartmann.com if you want to really support our program. So Lindsey Graham made this big announcement yesterday that he was giving to National Security Director Richard Grenell, the super, MAGA hat guy, the new national security guy, all this information. We're gonna unredact and release this information. We're gonna get it out about unmasking Michael Flynn. Oops. Turns out Michael Flynn was never masked. His conversations with Kislyak always identified Michael Flynn as the guy having the conversation. What Flynn was lying about, it turns out, and there's a great piece about this by Mark Sumner over at dailycodes.com, It's titled, Lindsey Graham's Latest Effort to Embarrass the Obama Administration Backfires Spectacularly. What the FBI was, what Michael Flynn was lying about, what he lied to Mike Pence about, what he lied to the FBI about. Well, we don't know if he lied to Mike Pence or not. Trump put that in a tweet as the excuse for firing him. But what we do know that he lied to the FBI about, now that this has been released, was not that he was talking with Kislyak, the Russian ambassador. They knew that. They actually had those transcripts, and he had never been masked in the first place because he was a high-level government official. What he was lying about was coordinating it with Mar-a-Lago. Presumably Donald Trump or Don Jr. or Jared Kushner, probably, somebody. They were coordinating this whole, hey, tell the Russians, don't get all hysterical. Yes, Obama put sanctions on, but don't react to it. We're going to come into office in a couple of weeks and we'll make everything good again, and don't worry. I mean, we don't have the transcripts, so I can't say that that's absolutely what was said, but, it makes perfect sense because right after Flynn had those meetings, President Putin came out and said, we're not going to react. So it looks like what Flynn was lying about was his coordination with Mar-a-Lago. And, stuff that would have been really useful to come out during the impeachment hearings. But here we are. John in Kingston, Tennessee. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, listen, I heard you talk maybe yesterday about this new Medicare plan as being something we shouldn't, that's not good.
Yeah, I'll recap very quickly for you, John. There's basically, prior to 2005, if you went on Medicare, when Medicare was passed back in, I think it was 67, the Republicans demanded that the average person, you and me, have, quote, skin in the game. That was their phrase. Everybody was talking in the 60s about skin in the game. And so only 80% of your doctor bill and your hospital bills are covered by Medicare. And the other 20% you're supposed to pay yourself. Well, back in 1967, it wasn't that much money. But now it's a lot of money, that 20%, because we've had, because it's a whole long story. But anyway, because the health insurance industry has basically, and the health care industry, the hospital industry, have basically moved out of the nonprofit model and into the for-profit model. So now it's very expensive. So there's two ways the insurance industry came up with one way to solve that problem. And it was perfectly legal. It was built into the Medicare law, and that was selling a policy that fills in that 20% hole. These are called Medigap policies because that 20% hole is referred to as the gap. Yeah. And so if you get regular Medicare and you get a Medigap policy, you can basically, assuming that you've got one of the better Medigap policies, you can go anywhere in the country, you can get sick, wherever it may be, you can visit any doctor you want as long as they take Medicare. There are some that don't, but the vast majority do. Basically, you got no limits. There's no limit on your lifetime benefit. They can't reject you. It's solid. It's Medicare. Well, in 2005, George W. Bush, right after the election, spent the first couple months of 2005. You may recall he famously said in January of 2005, I won this election. I've got a lot of political capital now, and I'm going to use that political capital to get Social Security privatized. And he campaigned. He went to 20-some-odd cities around the United States giving speeches about how we need to privatize Social Security. And what happened was the idea of privatizing Social Security became less popular rather than more popular the more Bush talked about it. So he gave up and went away. But part of Social Security is Medicare. Medicare was an amendment to the Social Security Act. And so Plan B for the Republicans and George W. Bush was, well, let's privatize Medicare if we can't privatize Social Security. And so in 2005, they passed a law that allowed private for-profit insurance companies to offer a product to people over 65 because they had been outlawed from doing that ever since 1967 by the Medicare law. They amended the Medicare law and said private for-profit companies can offer insurance plans and call them Medicare Part C, even though they have nothing to do with Medicare, except that they get a subsidy from Medicare. So part of the taxes that we all pay for Medicare are actually going to these private for-profit insurance companies. So these plans are typically called Medicare Advantage plans or Medicare Part C plans, but they are not government-paid Medicare. They have specific limits. You have to be within the network rather than out of the network. You know, if you live in an area where there's a lot of providers who are in the network of your Medicare Advantage provider, you may never notice that it's, you know, that different because there's lots of options for you to get treatment. But if you live in a more marginal area, or if you happen to be traveling, or if you start getting real expensive, these companies have the ability every year to drop you and to refuse to continue covering you. And every procedure that you ask for, that your doctor asks for, he has to run by them. I mean, it's the same old crappy for-profit insurance company trying to screw us. And it's insanely profitable for them. They're advertising all over TV, particularly, you know, in the fall during the Medicare reapplication window, when people can move out of Medicare and into Medicare Advantage. And about 25 to 35% of Americans now over 65 have picked up these plans. And, you know, I get calls from people all the time who are like, holy cow, you know, you get sick and you got a problem. They say, oh, we're going to cover your dental, we're going to cover your vision, and they give you some funds or something. But if you get really sick, you're going to have a problem. John, thanks a lot for the call. We'll be right back. It's 28 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen. And so it is again now. Any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspect of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In this book, I focus on the economic aspects of socialism, how it differs from capitalism in broad outlines. I'm more interested in socialist critiques of capitalism and their implications about socialist alternatives than in the particulars of the few early experiments in erecting socialist systems, USSR, People's Republic of China, and so on, that history so far offers. Finally, my own education and work constrain me to concentrate on Western Europe and North America. Some important aspects of socialism are thus not covered or discussed here. Yearnings for better lives, such as socialism proposes, are not new. In slave societies, the slaves hoped and dreamed of lives less hard and less out of their own control. Their yearning aimed to obtain freedom. They sought social change that would preclude any one person being the property of another. In feudal societies, the serfs, free in the sense that no one owned them, yearned for better lives too. Their subordination to lords included heavy labor and other burdens that they wanted lifted. They hoped and dreamed of a society in which they would not be bound to the land, the lord of that land, and the feudal dues of labor and subservience. The serfs mobilized in the 1789 French Revolution to demand liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In effect, the serfs had expanded on what the slaves had called freedom. In the American Revolution against British King George III, the revolutionaries were neither slaves nor serfs. They were mostly self-employed farmers, craftspeople, and merchants subject to a foreign feudal kingdom. They wanted liberty as individuals to pursue their dreams without hindrance from feudalism or monarchism, whether foreign or domestic. They added democracy to the goals advanced by the slaves and serfs before them. The different systems of slavery, feudalism, and small-scale self-employment produced masses of people yearning for better lives. Eventually, each of those systems provoked revolutions. Many people then sought to break away from and go beyond those systems. The French and American revolutions marked key moments in the social transformations of major pre-capitalist systems into capitalist ones. By capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production in which the basic human relation is employer-employee instead of master-slave, lord-serf, or individual self-employment. The revolutionaries who wanted and built capitalism hoped and believed the transition to employer-employee relations of production would bring with them the liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy they had yearned for. The revolution's leaders promised to themselves and to the people they led that those goals would be achieved. But the transition to capitalist employer-employee relations that increasingly replaced the previous slave, feudal, and self-employment relations of production had unintended consequences. Capitalism soon proved to be different from what its revolutionaries had hoped. While it enabled some people to be more free and more independent than slaves, serf, or self-employed subjects of monarchies had been, it also seriously limited freedom, independence, and democracy for many. Capitalism betrayed many of the promises made by its advocates. It produced and reproduced great inequalities of income and wealth. Poverty proved to be as endemic as capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty. The capitalist rich used their wealth to shape and control politics and culture. Democratic forms hid very undemocratic content. The cyclical instability attending capitalism constantly threatened and hurt large numbers of people, and so on. Growing numbers of employees within capitalism began to yearn for better lives. They defined those yearnings first in the familiar terms of the earlier French and American revolutions: equality, fraternity, liberty, and democracy. They criticized a capitalism that failed to deliver those to most people and demanded social changes to achieve them. Many people still continue to want a better, softer, friendlier capitalism, where government regulates and intervenes to achieve more of what the French and American revolutionaries had yearned for and promised. They are also often self-defined as socialists. However, capitalism's development provoked another, different perspective that also called itself socialism. In that view, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had masters' slaves, feudalism had lords' serfs, and monarchy had king subjects as their key sources of their inequalities, lack of freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production and capitalism generated parallel problems. Capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected. Kings mostly disappeared, but inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff.
Coming up on the Science Revolution this week, Dr. Michael Mann is here on heat, sea levels in the Amazon. Oh my. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available.
So we have a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who are signed up, for supporters of our program. And it's about how Donald Trump, 16 days after Mr. Khashoggi was murdered by the Saudis in Turkey and his body dismembered and vanished, 16 days after that happened, without notifying Congress and with virtually no mention to anybody, Donald Trump authorized the transfer of top secret nuclear technology to the Saudis. This should be a serious issue. Tim Kaine, the senator from Virginia, is raising hell about it because Khashoggi lived in Virginia. But I think everybody in Congress should be raising hell about this. And when you back this up with this new report out from ProPublica that the Saudis were involved in 9/11, it gets real interesting. So you can check that out over at thomhartmann.com. You know, look for our basically members-only video. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Mary in Little Mountain, South Carolina. Hey, Mary, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to comment on something you were saying about Medicare. My mother-in-law, she was in intensive care about 10 years ago. She had kidney failure, congestive heart failure, and she was in the ICU for almost 6 months. And then her husband, which was still alive at the time, my father-in-law, excuse me, and my husband received a letter from Medicare stating that she had reached her lifetime limit of $1 million, and then they took all the respirator, ventilator, the feeding tube, and stopped dialysis, and 2 days later she died on her own.
Yikes. Was that a Medicare Advantage plan?
I don't really know, maybe.
I'm pretty sure it would have to be, because I don't believe that there's a lifetime limit for Medicare.
So this was
and these lifetime limits, I mean,
yeah,
Louise was pushing up against a limit with our private health insurance company just from her breast cancer. So that's out there. But yeah, that's a grim story, Mary. I'm guessing that would be a Medicare Advantage plan. I may be wrong. I mean, it's possible that there are caps in Medicare, but to the best of my knowledge, there aren't. And if there are, I'm sure somebody will correct me. Mary, thank you for sharing your story with us. Richard in Los Angeles. Hey, Richard, what's on your mind today?
Thank you for taking my call, Tom. I just wanted to know, with all these phony investigations going on and the Republicans issuing subpoenas, can the Democrats dodge the subpoenas from the Republicans like the Republicans dodge the subpoenas from the Democrats without any repercussions?
Presumably. I don't know that. You mean in this let's get Obama in to testify? I would think that they would want to testify, Richard, because what Mike Flynn was up to was nasty stuff. And so if Obama or people from the Obama administration, Comey, these guys, if they come in and testify, I think it's going to reflect very, very, very badly on Donald Trump, because, Obama was doing the right thing. You've got a guy who is illegally, feloniously, like treasonously, illegally taking money from a foreign government. Mike Flynn had taken $500,000 from Turkey to act on Turkey's behalf, coming in as the national security advisor of the United States. And then he's cutting background deals with Russia while, and coordinating it with the new candidate, with Mar-a-Lago. That's pretty stinky stuff. And had we known that during the impeachment hearing, I think it would have gotten even more real. And so I actually think that it'll be a good thing if they end up, with this testimony. But yes, and generally speaking, if what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Richard, thanks for the call. Randy in Phoenix, Arizona. Hey, Randy, what's up?
Yeah, hi, Tom. Thank you for taking my call. A couple quick things. One is, boy, I just heard that blurb. You're the first guy I've ever heard on even the radio trying to connect Khashoggi with what went on between the Kushners and Trump. But the reason why I'm calling is I voted for Trump, and other than my ex-wife, probably the biggest mistake I ever made in my life. So I'm trying to ask you, I think November 3rd is obviously, the answer. The problem is this guy doesn't want to leave office, and I think, unfortunately, I can't believe that this actually deserves attention, but it is possible that he may not want to leave office. And I've always told my friends this would come down to who the military decides what side they want to be on. And I'm just trying to get your take on this. What do you think? I mean, is this real?
I think it's a legitimate concern, Randy. And interestingly, there was a poll that was just reported over at 536 or one of those websites that if Trump loses in 2020, the Republican Party will renominate him in 2024. That's the sentiment of the base. This is how deeply this love for Trump, this cult worship of Trump, has been anchored in people who are regular viewers of Fox News. And, we'll see what the next 4 years bring. But this is a question that Bill Maher and I have been bringing up over and over and over again over the last year or two. Is, Trump, it's not, if he's not going to leave, he says he's not going to leave. He has, he has repeatedly said it. He hasn't asserted he won't leave if he loses. Instead, what he has said is if he loses, it'll be the result of fraud, which kind of implies that he won't leave. So, I am hopeful that the Democratic Party and their lawyers and whatnot have some plans for this in the individual states, but we could be wandering into uncharted territory. This guy is as unpredictable and weird and dismissive of law as was Andrew Jackson. In fact, more so. I mean, Andrew Jackson defied the Supreme Court twice. The Supreme Court told him he couldn't shut down the second bank. He did. They told him he couldn't do the Trail of Tears. He did. And he said, Roger Taney, who is then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, has made his decision. Let him enforce it. We'll see if, even if this went to the Supreme Court, will Trump say, okay, John Roberts made his decision. Let's see if he enforces it. I don't have an easy answer for it, Randy, and I'm very concerned about it. Randy, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. It's a really important issue, and I look forward to talking to you again. Jonathan in Portland. Hey, Jonathan, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. Wanted to remind folks about what Michael Flynn was all about before he became National Security Advisor, and you probably already know this, but he was negotiating with the Russians to build nuclear power plants throughout the Middle East, 45 nuclear power plants. And today, just 2 hours ago, Al Jazeera is reporting that Saudi Arabia is close to finishing their first reactor, and bin Salman is on record in 2018 as saying that they want to develop a bomb if Iran's going to do it. So, right. Flynn is crazy. Flynn is just out of his mind. Besides being greedy,
well, I think he was just following the money. I mean, Turkey gave him $500,000. I didn't know about his negotiating for these nuclear reactors. Was that on behalf of Turkey? I mean, who?
No. That was working with the Russians, and it's well reported on. You can read it, the mainstream press. But it really has been downplayed. No one's really talking about it. But as far as I'm concerned, that was really the most egregious thing that he did. He was just wanted to make money building nuclear power plants and just pouring gasoline on a fire in the Middle East.
Is the Saudi reactor an American design or a Russian design?
No. I don't know what the design is, but it's almost completed, and they are not a member of the IAEA, so there's no inspections. Great article on it now in Al Jazeera, arms control experts concerned by Saudi nuclear reactor push.
I'll check
that out. His lying to Pence, which was why he was fired, I guess, and investigated, that's the least of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Beachside Bill in Orlando, Florida. Hey, Bill, what's up?
Hi, Tom. It's nice to talk to you. I live here at Beachside. I'm just south of the Kennedy Space Center, where next Wednesday, the 27th, is going to be a launch, the first one in 9 years, to the International Space Station from U.S. soil. I have several concerns about it. I've lived here all my life, but my main concern is Trump taking the credit for this. And he's going to make a big to-do about nothing, because actually it was President Obama who opened up the doors here for these private corporations, which is going to be SpaceX and Elon Musk, who owns it. They are going to launch it. And the only thing Trump has done is kneecap NASA. NASA's like a subcontractor now. But if something happens to this rocket, who's going to get the blame but NASA? And think about these billionaires. You're always talking about these billionaires. Well, Elon Musk, a lot of his money he didn't earn. It's our money. NASA gave him a $10 billion contract, I believe, in 2017, if my memory serves me well, to come up with the command module. It's fashioned after the Apollo module, except it's updated now. So it's going to be interesting, and they're encouraging people to come here. And they're expecting 250,000 people along the beach here. And
whoa!
To watch the
liftoff.
Yeah, to watch the liftoff. And I see it out my back door here. I get it right out my back door. But the problem is, from Trump on down to the local sheriff here, Wayne Ivey, they're all encouraging people to come here. And the hotels are already booked in Cocoa Beach and Cape Canaveral, all up there. It's going to be something. It's going to be historic, but the thing is, President Obama should get the credit. There's a whole history behind the space shuttle,
let's hope that these two new astronauts don't take COVID up to the space station. That would be a disaster.
Well, that too. They're in quarantine, but they've been checked and all that, and they flew on the shuttle, so they've already been quarantined and everything. They just flew in yesterday. Right. So.
Oh, okay. Well, let's
for your information.
Okay, Bill. Thank you very much for the call. Fascinating stuff. 45 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Taking back the mainstream media 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, right here.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And we will be back with more of your calls in just a moment. Stay tuned. And welcome back. Jerry in Arizona. Hey, Jerry, in Yucca, Arizona. Hey, Jerry, what's on your mind?
Yeah, it's Yucca, Arizona. You got that right, Tom. Hey, I was just kind of wondering, and I've talked to a lot of people out here where I'm at, kind of a pretty rural area, but I don't know what's up with the Republican Party anymore. I don't really think it's the Republican Party. It's more like the Tea Party or the party of Trump. But, you know, I've mentioned to people and whatnot of, you know, my disdain against the government and the way it's going, and I think we got some real problems and whatnot. And it seems like no matter who I talk to, it's like those are fighting words. If you don't have anything good to say about Donald Trump, you better watch out and get out of the way. And the only reason why I'm mentioning this is I keep hearing over and over about how this state is turning purple, and but you know, out on the street, I don't see it at all.
So you're seeing a lot of maggots and Trumpies and stuff.
Well, you don't even have to see them. All you have to do is mention it. You know, I mean, we're talking about people that don't wear a MAGA hat or say anything. But if you say anything that slightly even sounds like you're against the way the government's operating right now, it's almost like you're in the wrong state.
Oh, that's interesting. I would keep saying it, Jerry, unless you're concerned about ending friendships or getting in fistfights. I think part of the process of causing people to change their mind is having them realize that they don't represent the consensus opinion.
No, I understand that, and I've tried to reiterate that, but it's just like it's almost as if they must watch Fox News so much that they have a closed mind. I mean, they're not willing to even discuss anything that's halfway reasonable. And, I kind of go back to this thought where, when Barack Obama was our president, they wouldn't let him do anything. I mean, he got some things done, but almost everything that he tried to do, the Republicans put a stop to it. They wouldn't hardly pass anything.
Including appointing a new member to the Supreme Court.
Exactly. I mean, that was egregious as far as I'm concerned. And so what in my mind seemed to happen was the people got tired of the government not working. And that was one of the things that they kept harping about, how the Republicans were going to get our government working again and blah, blah, blah. Well, the only thing that this administration has done that I can see is dismantle our government. And they're continuing to do that on a daily basis.
Excuse me. So when you bring up something like that with one of your friends there in Arizona, what do they say?
Oh, they get real offensive right off the bat. Oh,
you mean like, whoa, don't talk like Trump? Do they dispute the facts, or do they?
No, they just come up with this stuff like he's the best thing that's ever happened to this country, and he's got the cojones to stand up and tell people the truth instead of all this milly mouth baloney,
Yeah, I get it. Jerry, thanks for the call. Wow, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. Keep talking though, and call back in a few weeks and let us know what is going on. We'll be right back with more of your calls in just a moment. Stick around. Thom Hartmann here. Did you know that the Second Amendment was written to protect the slave patrols in South Carolina and Georgia back in the day? It's in my new book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment, available wherever you find great books. We have a new video over at thomhartmann.com for the people who support our program, and it's an interesting one. The phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, has a really interesting history, and the exploitation of that phrase and that history by right-wingers in 20th century America, or late 20th century America, now 21st century America, also has a fascinating and rather grim history. Just the general absurdity of the idea that somebody can lift themselves off the ground by reaching down and pulling on a strap on their boots. think about it for a second. But it's used. This is used as justification by right-wingers, particularly over the last 40 years since the Reagan Revolution, to say, "Oh, poor people. It's all, their poverty is their own fault." Check it out. It's over at ThomHartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Carol in Idaho Falls, Idaho. Hey, Carol, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I was wondering, do you ever watch on C-SPAN, the Washington Journal, early in the morning, about 5 o'clock?
It's been years. I used to do it when I lived on the East Coast, but I haven't since I moved out here.
Okay, the topic of conversation this morning, they had people call in, and the topic of conversation was, what do people think about the Senate voting today on getting subpoenas on Obama's cabinet members that listened to this, that did this unmasking? That's what the whole program was about. And right after the program was supposedly the Senate hearing where Lindsey Graham they were going to vote on it. So I waited, and I was going to see if Lindsey Graham, went on with his thing, and they waited for 10 minutes to get everybody in the room, and then about 2 minutes, Lindsey Graham gavelled them out for their vacation.
Right, because he figured out in the last 24 hours that that Michael Flynn was never masked, and therefore he was never unmasked. That what the FBI was concerned with was his coordination with Mar-a-Lago, and if that comes out, if they actually have testimony, that's going to come out, and it's going to come out more than it has already. It's going to come out in a way that Americans can see somebody testify to that effect, and that's got to have the Republicans scared. You know what?
Well, Lindsey Graham told Trump, "You better watch out what you ask for." He knows it.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right. Carol, thanks a lot for that. That's fascinating. Paul in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind today?
Tom, I've heard now from two doctors, one a person I know, and now earlier this morning, one of the shows I was listening, I can't remember, but that Trump is in all likelihood not being truthful about taking hydroxychloroquine, and what tipped him off is the dosage that he related. He said he takes it every day. And what both of these people, or what my friend told me and what this other doctor said on this morning, was that nobody would take hydroxychloroquine every day unless you were severely infected with malaria, which is what it's made for, or you were in very late stage lupus, near, very, very late, and suffering. Really? Yeah, and that normally the dosage, the preventive dose for malaria, say you were traveling someplace where you might be infected by mosquitoes with malaria, you would take once a week. You would take your pill once a week for 2 to 3 weeks before you left. Yeah, and then you take once a week, and you keep once a week while you're there.
To Africa. Yeah. And so here's my theory on this, Paul. I am guessing Trump went to the White House doctor and said, "I want some hydroxychloroquine." The guy said, "Okay, cool, I'll get it for you because you're the president." He gets him the very lowest dose possible, and then says, take a half a pill or a quarter of a pill. Or they've got a compounding pharmacy, and he says to the pharmacist, make some capsules that are 1 milligram, not the 100 milligrams or 200 milligrams, 1 milligram in each capsule, put a label on it that says hydroxychloroquine, and give it to Trump. He was taking the equivalent of Flintstone vitamins. What do you think?
Right. Well, there's that. I don't even think it's that likely. I think he isn't taking anything, and you can see that was it yesterday or the day before. His out was, I'm going to try it for another week or two, see how it goes. Well, wait a minute, because he's feeling the pushback that, hey, you shouldn't have said this. So now in a week or so, he's going, no, I'm not taking that anymore, even though it's supposed to be a preventive, which I think really, Tom, what's really upsetting is that, first of all, I bet you that 90% of the people in this country don't know what a virus is. They don't know how it works. They don't understand that chloroquine can do nothing to kill a virus, first of all, because it's not alive. It works on malaria because malaria, Plasmodium, is a bacterial infection within itself. And there are people who are immune to Plasmodium with sickle cell. That's what sickle cell, heterozygous sickle cell is meant to do, is people are who are, that's just basic genetics they teach in high school. But No, he's not. As a preventative for anything, it's other than malaria, is ridiculous. It's just stupid. And now he's going to weed a lot of us. And now I'm not taking it anymore. But that's what I heard. The dosage. You see, liars have some things that always give them away, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And whether he's being scammed by his doctor, who's giving him placebo doses, or whether he was simply lying to all of us. And I tend to agree with you, Paul, that it was the latter.
That's a scary thing, though. That's a scary thing. That's a scary thing.
But he does that all the time. I mean, the Washington Post has documented, Paul, that he lies on average 12 times a day.
No, I'm talking about his doctor. If his doctor's doing that and lying to us, that's scary.
Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah, there you go. Paul, thank you for the call. Hey, and thanks to all the folks who help out with our program. Louise Hartman, Sean Taylor, Nate Atwell, Joyce Nance, Nigel Peacock, Susan Heathercutt, Patrick Hoyt, Geraldine Halbert, Dave Fulton, Ron Hartenbaum, Chase Spross, Nicholas Miller, Pat Sweeney, and Jabberwocky. Thank you all. We will be back after the holiday, and I hope that you have a wonderful, safe time in this Memorial Day holiday. And please, take a break. Be good to yourself. Be good to your friends. Do something pleasant, and stay away from crowds. Tag you're it. We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.